We're going to get started. This is the Portland Planning Sustainability Commission meeting, August 12th, 2014. We have today for items of for the agenda, call to order, items of interest from the commissioners, and then director's report. Consent agenda from meeting minutes from 7/22, our last commission meeting. And then we have a series of briefings. The first one, comprehensive plan maps. The second one, Central City 2035 West Quadrant Plan. It's a briefing. And the last mixed-use zone project is a briefing. To get started, we'll have items of interest from commissioners. Chris?
So I need to amend the record. At the last meeting, we were asked to list our committee involvements, and I did an egregiously bad job of recalling the committees that I'm on. So as not to offend the people I serve on with those committees, let me just list them all. I mentioned the Climate Action Plan update. I saved that one. I'm also a member of the Transportation Expert Group working on the TSP, and I serve as a city budget advisor, where my role has been primarily to represent the Portland plan. So I think that probably lists as a planning commission involvement. So my apologies to those that I omitted.
Any other omissions? Other items from commissioners? Oh, Catherine?
I just want to give thanks to Mike for inviting us on the Ride of the Visionaries. I had a wonderful afternoon. It was a great, I'm going to say glide. I was a little nervous because I haven't ridden my bike all summer, but it was pretty easy ride. It was really nice. Great contacts, great conversations. So thank you, Mike, for extending that invitation.
Good. Yes. Yeah.
Bud Clark made it. Bud Clark made it all the way, Howard.
Yeah. Susan? You're good? Okay. Consent agenda, consideration of minutes from 7/22/2014. Second. All in favor? Aye. Approved. Comprehensive plan maps, Eric and Deborah.
So we can't hear you.
We can.
Microphone.
Good afternoon. I'm Deborah Stein. I am a principal planner. I've been working on the comprehensive plan, and we're going to be talking about the comprehensive plan map. As you know, this is the second of your 3 briefings in advance of the testimony that we'll be hearing starting in September. So this is to kind of get you briefed on the map. We're not going to do a full walkthrough of the map. We want to touch on some particularly interesting mapping issues that we know you'll be hearing testimony about. So, but I do want to do an overall introduction to start. And I'm going to be joined by some of my colleagues to talk about different issues that we'll be seeing in the map. Oops. Okay. So the comprehensive plan map is a graphic depiction of the land uses in the year 2035. And it's a map that's supported by infrastructure investments, and the map reflects the goals and policies of the plan. When you're reviewing the map app, as most people are using that tool to see what we're proposing, it may come across as a lot of fragmented changes, just colors on the map that are fragmented. And we've presented the map app in these discrete layers to make it easy for people to see what's being proposed for change. But I think what's really important to note is that the comprehensive plan map is actually a cohesive whole. It's not just a bunch of fragmented changes. The citywide map really needs to hang together, and a part of your job is to make sure that all of the comprehensive plan map really does represent the kinds of goals and policies that we're trying to carry out in the plan. So when you're recommending adoption of a map after your testimony, after all your deliberations, you'll be adopting something or recommending adoption of something that's the entire map, not just the changes. And you'll be essentially reaffirming the parts that are in between all the proposed changes, because those are also part of this map, and really only about 10% of the land area or the properties in the city are proposed for change. So you're really recommending adoption of 100% of that map and what it all looks like when it hangs together. You've heard this mentioned before, but through all of our analysis, we have found that the city currently has an enormous amount of capacity for new development. So our task with looking at updating this map is not to add capacity just to add for the sake of adding capacity, but making sure that where we have development capacity is where it makes most sense to carry out the goals and policies. So overall, I think the premise behind the update of the map is to encourage growth where it can most effectively support complete neighborhoods, active, healthy living, meet our demand for jobs, reduce carbon emissions. We're really trying to be fine-tuning the map to make sure we can carry out those goals. And at the same time, we have the opportunity to de-emphasize growth in locations that are further from or costlier to provide services to, places where we might be putting people or structures at risk because of steep slopes or drainage challenges or other natural hazards, or where there are other constraints that suggest that those aren't the optimal places to be concentrating growth. So essentially, we're doing some right sizing. We're taking a look at places where we can fine-tune the map to better match development to the land, to the development capacity, the development patterns, where services are available, and even school district capacity. It's one of the things we've been looking at carefully to do that kind of right sizing of our development. Another thing we're doing through the map update is we're adding approximately 2,000 acres of land that is committed for open space in some way. And that's not just parks, but it also might be flood storage, stormwater management, habitat, water quality protection, and other kinds of goals that can be accomplished through preserving open space. So we're updating the map to show another 2,000 acres. All of that is owned by public agencies, and it's being committed to those open space uses. So as I mentioned, we're not going to do a full walk through the map, but we want to touch on 4 areas that I think are of particular interest. I think these are areas where we're proposing some things that will result in some changes. We think we'll be hearing some testimony, or in some cases we already are, on some of these areas. So these are the things I want to touch on in this briefing today. Job growth, natural hazards and limited services, residential densities, and jobs and housing in East Portland. What we're not touching on in this presentation, but you will later in the agenda this afternoon, is to look at centers and corridors and mixed use, because you have another briefing on mixed use, so we'll save that for that. So before I go into the map, I just want to touch on this really quickly, because we have a lot of questions we hear from the public, and you might have the same questions, and that's, what's the difference between the comprehensive plan map, which is what we're reviewing now, and zoning, which is what a lot of people just talk about and what's a little bit more familiar to most folks. So essentially the difference is that the comprehensive plan map is looking into the future, 20 years from now. It's the kind of the ultimate land use designation map. Zoning is what is allowed today. For the most part, those two match up, but we do have places in the city today where there's a different comprehensive plan designation than the zoning, and that difference may be because there's a longer range vision of what the place ought to be, but the services aren't yet in place to get there, or there may be something else missing that needs to change before that designation can be reached. So we do have a few places where there are differences, and there may be places we propose in this update where there may be some differences. You will be seeing a zoning map separate from this map coming in the spring as one of our Task 5 implementation projects. So you will be seeing a new zoning proposal, which again will for the most part match up with a comprehensive plan map that we're looking at now, but there may be some distinct differences. So you'll be seeing that in the spring. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Eric to talk about the first area, which is adding capacity in our proposed comprehensive plan map to add capacity for jobs. And I'm going to hand him the mic.
Can I ask how many of you have had a chance to look at the map app yet and to go on there? And okay, great. So if, those of you who haven't, if you want, feel free to call Eric and he can walk you through it and sit down with you and talk, through some of the changes. I think it's both easy to understand, but also it's an opportunity to kind of dig into the key issues that each of you care about.
Thank you. My name is Eric Engstrom, Principal Planner with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I'm going to talk about one category, and as Deborah mentioned, for purposes of communication, the online map app divided all the map changes into 4 categories, and one of them was related to job growth. This is one of sort of the core things that is part of the comprehensive planning process. If we accomplish nothing else, we have to make sure that we have a plan that meets our jobs, our projected job need, our projected housing needs, and we have to make sure our infrastructure is right-sized to that expected growth, and that's kind of the core exercise. So this is a collection of changes that relate to the employment balancing equation in that work. And there's a couple subcategories, and this is generally how we've tried to organize all of the mapping changes, is that we built off these 4 broad categories, but then there's a lot of subcategories below that, and the chart that's on your table is a summary of the number of acres affected by these different types of changes within the different categories, right? And then actually on the flip side is a summary of the impact that those changes had on our jobs and housing equations. It's not the full picture because there obviously are jobs and housing in areas that we didn't change, but this is part of the analysis. First category was in the draft employment opportunities analysis that you previously reviewed. We found that colleges and hospitals was a major growth sector in our economy, and also importantly associated with fairly high wage jobs. And so there's a number of proposals to basically take the largest colleges and hospitals in the city and give them an employment designation. And we have an implementation project that follows up on that will figure out what that means at the zoning code level in terms of how it affects neighborhoods' input to their master planning process and dealing with transportation impacts and all the things that we deal with large institutions. But at the comp plan level, we're proposing that map change. So it affects places like Lewis and Clark, Reed, University of Portland. We're not changing PSU or OHSU because they already have employment designations on the current zoning map and comp plan. So that's the first category of changes. And again, we're developing the rules for what that means through this sub-project called the Institutional Zoning Project, which will come before you in 2015 with more of those details. Second thing I'd call out on there is there's a small change in Gateway. Gateway, as you may recall, is the city's largest center outside the central city, and both in terms of concentration of housing and expected concentration of jobs. A lot of Gateway 10 or 20 years ago was subject to some fairly large-scale upzoning and up-designation to create that capacity for it to eventually become a second downtown serving East Portland. A small section of that, and I'm talking about an area between I-205 and about 102nd Avenue between, I think it's Stark and Gleason in that general area. A small section there is fairly kind of light industrial in character right now. So it hasn't developed housing yet. And we're proposing to move that back to an employment designation with a bit of a thinking that as the places like the Central East Side increase in value and get denser, and that some businesses may be displaced from that kind of environment, and that having more employment land in Gateway as a node that could maybe in the future function a little bit like the Central East Side does to downtown, so that second downtown also has its associated employment district where there wouldn't be housing and there'd be a little more flexibility to do the kinds of things that happen in the Central East Side as those smaller businesses need land to have startup activity and to get messy and do their work. So there's one change in Gateway there. There's a similar related change with the same idea in mind for a section of 82nd Avenue south of Montevilla and north of the PCC campus. It's right now, the existing land uses are sort of a combination of auto-oriented uses and dealerships and some light manufacturing. It's not become a mecca of mixed-use housing yet, and so we're proposing to retain that strip of 82nd as a more employment-focused area. And this is really the first discussion of 82nd in what inevitably will probably become a follow-up refinement plan that we take on after the comp plan in terms of doing much more fine-grained look at 82nd Avenue. But we're putting this forward now because it relates to our employment issues and providing land capacity. There's a couple other scattered changes in East Portland related to job growth. One maybe to make note of is near the Park Rose School campus at what's currently Rossi Farm. There's a proposal to slightly reconfigure the zoning pattern there. It's currently zoned high-density housing. We're not aware of any immediate plan for the farm to go away, but we're proposing to change the mix of zoning there to increase the number of acres that would be for employment on that site as well. So that's one example of a smaller scale change that affects East Portland. And the broader agenda is to provide more employment land base in East Portland so that we can attract higher paying jobs to that area. And through our analysis of where jobs and housing is located, we know that there's kind of a mismatch of good jobs within close proximity to East Portland, and so we're looking carefully at that balance. The next category, and we'll move to the next slide, relates to, there's not very many places where we're actually proposing additional industrial land. For the most part, the main move related to industrial land supply is to protect the existing supply through investment in brownfield cleanup and also investment in freight transportation projects that support the full utilization of our existing land supply. But there is one place where we're suggesting some conversion to industrial land, and that's in this location, kind of straddling 33rd Avenue, the Broadmoor, and I think that's the Riverside, is that the Riverside Golf Course? Both of those, again, not any immediate plans for those to close that we're aware of, but this is a 20-year plan. So changing the comprehensive plan designation to a mix of open space and industrial land, a little bit mimicking the agreement that was made at the Colwood Golf Course to the east. We're not proposing to move forward in 2015 with zoning changes to correspond. Those zoning changes would wait until there's a more specific plan to be negotiated, similar to how agreement was reached with Colwood. But this is one place where we believe there's kind of on the long term, a declining demand for golf and an increasing demand for industrial space that can kind of work with each other, and it creates an opportunity should those property owners want to take advantage of that. I'm sure there'll be some testimony about that. The other change, just to highlight that I'm sure there'll be testimony about, is the portrayal of West Hayden Island on the comprehensive plan. And a couple things by way of context is the comp plan is a map of all the land uses within our urban services boundary. So it actually extends in a number of places beyond the city boundary and covers land that is not currently annexed into the city. And we're required by the regional plan to have a comp plan that goes to our full urban services boundary. And there's some other examples of that in residential land. For example, in Washington County, there's some Washington County land that's within our urban services boundary there where we had not previously had a comp plan designation. And there's some areas at the edge along Clackamas County's boundary as well where there's a lack of a comp plan designation that we have to do that. So it's not unique in that sense, but it is probably more, will be debated more. The thinking is that we have an existing policy framework that represents kind of a status quo situation on West Hayden Island. It's been brought into the UGB. You've adopted a recommendation for it, which has not been taken up by City Council. We also have one council-adopted resolution that was passed in 2010 that set the basic parameters of a mix of uses for open space and marine terminal development. So what we've done here is establish a special designation for West Hayden Island that embodies that policy mix, and essentially we believe represents kind of the status quo policy for where we're at. It does not fully implement details of annexation because this isn't an annexation decision, but it sets the sort of the core policy framework consistent with the council's 2010 resolution, which ultimately was, your recommendation was consistent with too, of a 300-acre, 500-acre split for marine terminal development and ecosystem improvements. Putting it on the comp plan does not cause annexation or necessarily predetermine annexation, but it sets up a policy basis and a mapping basis for what we do next should that proposal come back to council at some point in the future. It's also important to note that this is not a zoning decision. We're not proposing to zone West Hayden Island anything other than what it's already zoned, which is a county farm forest zone. So that would be retained. And again, we're not proposing to annex at this time because that's on hold at the moment. So this essentially, we believe, is a placeholder designation setting the right policy in the comp plan that would allow us to pick that proposal up should it be picked up in the future, while basically complying with the regional plan that we have a designation for the site. And there maybe are several other ways we could have gone about that, and I'm sure you'll talk about that as we get into the public hearings and the work sessions. And now I'm going to turn it over to Roberta Jortner to talk about some of the natural hazards and constraint issues that led to some down designation proposals.
So before I hand it over to Roberta, I was just going to show you that this next area that we're going to talk about natural hazards and drainage constraints, I've shown here a map.
Could we back up to questions of Eric, or is this just a briefing? I mean, way early on, I had a question. I thought I'd wait till the end of the group of map changes you're offering. When are the questions appropriate to that?
You want to wait and do questions?
Do you want to do them now, or do you want to wait to the end?
It's up to you.
It's just a quick one. It has to do with colleges and hospitals.
Yeah, let's ask now.
I agree. I've lived in Portland long enough to remember Emmanuel and Good Sam doing a lot of creeping in the neighborhood that the neighbors were alarmed about. Does this map change kind of reauthorize that, or in any way? It kind of was just a little number that occurred to me. That's a serious issue when you talk not so much about the colleges, but the hospitals and how they don't contribute to job growth, really.
The proposal is to map the existing boundaries of the campus. So it would still require a map change for them in the future if they wanted to expand the campus. It's the campus zoning project is more about what are the rules within the campus, and particularly things like floor areas and dealing with transportation impacts for improvements that are within their existing boundaries.
So to follow up on Howard's point, I was going to save this to the end, but since we're talking about it, help me understand the distinction between the, I think it's institutional campuses, the comp plan designation you're proposing, and the underlying zoning and sort of what that allows. My interest is in seeing what I think of as a sort of a more holistic knitting of these institutions into the community. So, maybe you have an institutional building here, you have some neighbor commercial uses here, another institutional building, and all kind of knits together as opposed to a hard edge. Mm-hmm. And how will that comp plan designation translate into actual zoning and what land uses are allowed?
Right now, many of these campuses have residential zoning underneath, and so they go through a, often low-density residential, they go through a conditional use hearings process every decade or so to re-up their master plan. And what we're talking about is shifting to a more base zone that acknowledges that these are employment zones and have a community function, as you said, and also provide jobs. One of the problems with the conditional use process is it also kind of does contribute to that hard wall, because often you're reviewing impacts and you don't want to allow impacts other than the institution. And so having a community serving use in the campus can kind of be messy with the conditional use process. So this is a different approach. Our thinking is that we're not going to immediately change all the zoning at once, that we would allow some transfer from the existing framework as the existing master plans kind of sunset out. So campuses, colleges and hospitals also often have an existing master plan that has an end date. And as those end dates come up, they will have the opportunity to shift to this new zone that's being developed that would then take it in a slightly different direction. But that there would still be a role for consideration of community impacts and transportation impacts and periodic updates to master plans. It doesn't mean that everything would be allowed by right.
Eric, maybe you could mention the timeline generally for the institutional project.
Yeah, and this is probably true of all the implementation projects that relate to the comp plan, but they're trailing the policy and map proposals by 6 months to a year, and so we have advisory committees working on that project with the aim of having more specific proposals out for public review sometime this winter and beginning a hearings process with you in the early part of 2015 with hopeful adoption to council by the end of 2015 if it stays according to plan.
So Eric, just on the hospitals, it would give them, this change gives them basically the right to do their update a master plan without impact, without going through kind of that conditional use, but more importantly, they don't have to, I guess, engage the community in that extensive process about impacts to the community. It kind of gives them right to do that change without engaging the community in an extensive process.
Well, the process that goes with the new zone is being written, so it's not going to be an empty check that says no in community engagement. The new zones that are applied here will have community engagement requirements. It's just not going to be a conditional use process.
Okay.
So do you anticipate an actual institutional zone?
Potentially one or more institutional zones, but there would be provisions in those zones for required community engagement on updating of the plans, and there would be elements that deal with transportation impacts. So it's not moving to a complete sort of by right blank check that they can do whatever they want, but it is intended to change the policy to be a little more conducive to as Chris said, kind of integrating these facilities into the community.
But are there opportunities in the comp plan to set some requirements that would be basic with that institutional hospital zone that would be a requirement that would come with, that would be on the zone when it was enacted?
Well, that's the intent of that zoning project, is to set those requirements.
No, but the comp plan component, before you get to zoning, the comp plan, I don't know that we can get there, and maybe it's beforehand, but my concern is I look at a manual in that kind of open source process, and I don't know that's going to happen in the future, but without engaging the community and having some, I think we set somebody up down in the future, a community for kind of get rolled.
The policies in the comp plan do have some basic parameters for what the intent of that designation is, and it does talk about those subjects. So take a look at that language. I guess that's what we would.
Well, that's what I was wondering, if we could engage that policy conversation. Great.
Yeah, and there is material that talks about that in the comp plan policies. Good question.
Anybody else? Sorry.
Okay, so the next area we want to talk about are those proposed map changes that are designed to address natural hazards and drainage constraints. And the slide you're seeing here shows a screenshot from one of the layers from the map app, which is titled Risks and Service Gaps. but that is a combination of different factors. So what are circled here are the areas where the proposed changes are specifically designed to address natural hazards and drainage constraints. You'll hear about a couple of the other circled area, or the not circled areas in a minute. And I do want to just call your attention to one of your handouts that looks like this. This outlines 3 of the kind of categories of down designations where we're actually proposing to adjust downwards the residential capacity. And there are 3 main reasons for it. So what you're about to hear is one of those 3, and that's the top issue, which is natural hazards and drainage constraints. And I'm going to hand this over to, whoops. Yeah, Roberta, and Roberta is going to actually present this in a video, which I will show you in a minute.
There's hand signals. It has to stay with the mic.
Yeah, like 8 inches. Yeah.
So we've been trying our hand at making our own videos in-house because rather than send Roberta out to 4,000 places, this is a little more efficient.
Hi, I'm Roberta Jordner, and I work for the City of Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Many of Portland's beautiful hilly areas, like those in Southwest here, and in Northwest and near Powell Butte on the east side, have very steep slopes and ravines, and here rainwater doesn't soak into the soil easily. These areas typically don't have piped stormwater systems, so runoff goes directly into local streams. Landslide, wildfire, and earthquake-related...
This is sold a house.
Okay, thank you for being here. Oh, I was feeling so good that we had that in there. We tested this like 10 times.
It's gonna work. I got it.
We're with you. We've been there.
I was determined.
Many of Portland's beautiful hilly areas, like those in Southwest here, and in Northwest and near Powell Butte on the east side, have very steep slopes and ravines, and here rainwater doesn't soak into the soil easily. These areas typically don't have piped stormwater systems, so runoff goes directly into local streams. Landslide, wildfire, and earthquake-related risks are higher in these areas than in many other parts of the city. Heavy rainstorms can create unsafe conditions and damage homes and businesses, roads, and streams. Steep, narrow, windy roads make it tricky for emergency vehicles to get into these types of areas and for residents to evacuate in case of wildfire or other disasters. And in some areas, water supply pipes are too small to meet fire flow requirements. As the city updates its comprehensive plan, community stakeholders have asked planners to look at how much future growth could occur in these areas. They're concerned about the potential costs and impacts of this growth, and also whether there are increased risks on public health and safety. Turns out that Portland's current zoning would allow existing development to more than double in the areas we're looking at. This means more demand on already limited infrastructure systems. And while the city is investing in stormwater management and other improvements, projects in these types of areas can get very expensive. In addition, removing trees from steep slopes to make way for more development would increase the risks of landslides and erosion and would negatively impact water quality and wildlife habitat. Stormwater runoff from buildings and pavement can impact neighboring properties and contribute to downstream flooding. In response to these concerns, the proposed comprehensive plan includes land use changes to reduce the amount of future development that can occur in these areas. The proposal would still allow new development, but property owners wouldn't be able to create as many new lots as they can today. At the same time, the comp plan proposal would guide future growth to centers and corridors with nearby urban services and fewer natural hazards. While reducing future development won't solve existing problems in these areas, it can help protect public health and safety in the future by keeping them from getting much worse over time. So check out the map app to see where the city is proposing land use changes in areas with drainage problems and natural hazards.
That's our talent. she's not, we're gonna get blacklisted for
I
using
know.
it.
$50,000.
Yeah.
Just, that's a good thing.
Diesel.
So that will save a little time on this presentation. We do want to add just a little more detail so you have more information when you start getting testimony on this proposal. The areas that you just heard about are about 720 acres, which is less than 1% of the city. And most of them are being proposed to shift from R10 to R20, comp plan, then zoning. A few would go from R5 or R7 to R10 or R20, and one would change from R1 to R5. When you saw the map, you could see it was relatively small areas, so clearly those are not all the areas in the city that face natural hazards, landslide, wildfire, et cetera, and infrastructure constraints, but they actually represent a sort of a unique convergence of areas with tremendous development potential, large clusters of lots that are, when you look at those areas, about 80 to 100% further dividable. And while it, on average, it would the current zoning would allow development to more than double or triple. In some of these areas, the growth could be more than 5 times as much, or even up to 20 times as much, particularly in some of the areas near Powell Butte that are currently comp plan zone and zone R5. So these areas of development potential then converge with the natural hazards and the infrastructure constraints and make the down designation, down zoning tool an appropriate tool. We are looking at other tools to deal with these types of issues in other parts of the city, but these areas were isolated as areas that would make sense. We also looked at proximity to urban services and the character of the area. We went out there. Most of these areas are actually abutting either lower density areas that are R20, some are adjacent to the county, and some are adjacent to large open space areas, either publicly owned or owned by the Columbia Land Trust, et cetera. So their character, they aren't built out, so their character is actually very similar to the lower density areas that they are adjacent to. So, one question, would these areas ever really build out to the current zoning? Well, probably not. I mean, based on the current development, they're not developing at the same rate as other areas. It's costly to develop. Sometimes it's difficult to approve stormwater discharge points and so forth. But therefore, the proposal actually does more than just reducing risk and demand on limited infrastructure. It actually realigns Portland's comp plan and zoning to a more realistic development scenario in the future. We're calling it sort of land use, truth, and advertising. In terms of feedback, the initial proposals, well, there were some initial concepts in part 2 of the comp plan update that looked at stormwater management challenge areas and talked about the types of tools the city might look at to address those. We then refined the proposal based in large part on coordination with the Bureaus of Environmental Services, Development Services, Transportation, Fire and Rescue, and Water. We also heard preliminary feedback from not only the policy expert groups, but from some stakeholders we've been sort of talking about the proposal very generally with before it was even released. And we know that you can expect some property owners to be concerned about reduced development potential on the property and the effects on their property value. We'll explain that the proposal will still allow roughly 60 to 70% more development of homes in the future across these areas instead of the tripling on average, double or tripling. So this isn't insignificant growth, and we are not intending to create any unbuildable sites where it's vacant today, and we wouldn't want to create the situation where you can't develop a house, for sure. That will not occur. And a number of properties will still be able to subdivide, but just not as many. This won't pacify folks necessarily, but hopefully they'll get why it's important to have this discussion right now, at least. We also know that some property owners will support the proposal. Some neighborhoods have asked for the city to take action to address stormwater and hazard issues. Linton, for one, areas near Oaks Bottom, another. And we've even gotten initial comments back from at least one person who said the city is finally listening to our concerns about hazards, about traffic issues, and flooding and so forth. So you're going to hear a lively mix of comments, we're sure. And on that note, just to reiterate that we know that this tool, reducing the density, won't in itself eliminate all risks from current or future development or improve, current conditions necessarily. So the city will continue to need to invest in green and gray infrastructure in these areas in a targeted way, as well as looking at other tools such as impervious area standards that we may be doing post-comp plan. And we'll also be needing to do additional natural hazard mitigation strategies into the future. So that's it. If you have questions. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to hand this over to Marty Stockton.
Mike has a question.
I'll wait for the end.
Oh, okay, you sure?
I'm sorry.
So again, I'm Marty Stockton. I'm a city planner and I'm the Southeast District Liaison. And today I'm going to be summarizing the category of proposed map changes in residential areas further from centers and corridors. So there are residential densities in a small number of neighborhoods, and to be specific, it is actually, for the most part, subdivisions, subdivision plats, or small areas within the neighborhood association boundaries that we are looking to reduce to better match up with their prevalent lot patterns. These are adjustments to residential densities that are further from centers and corridors, and in some cases where sidewalks and access to services are lacking. Proposed changes better align planning with on-the-ground character within these neighborhoods. So I'm going to go through the map and kind of call out some specific areas. So starting in North Portland and within the Portsmouth neighborhood to the north, to the Reed Neighborhood Association, it's actually the Reedwood subdivision in Reed, a portion of Eastmoreland, and then a portion within Brentwood Darlington, and also within Lentz Neighborhood Association. There is existing R5 zoning, which is an awkward fit because many of these lots are predominantly within the R7 designation, or are closer to the 7,000 square foot lot size. Elsewhere in Brentwood, Darlington, and specifically to its neighbor to the north in the Mount Scott Arletta area, there are lot sizes that are predominantly 5,000 square feet. Actually, they kind of range from kind of a 4,000 to 8,000 square feet. But this area currently has a designation of R2.5. In these two areas, we are concerned that this designation may cause redevelopment and potential displacement of existing residences, or residents, excuse me. This is also an area specific to the Brentwood, Darlington, and Mount Scott Arletta that is currently lacking sidewalks and improved streets, and it's not near a center. Its closest arterial or area to the north is Woodstock, and Woodstock has no kind of commercial retail or services within walking distance. So then heading farther east to actually the northeast corner of the city, in the Argay and Wilkes area, there is a R3 designated area, and we're proposing that to go to an R5 for some of the same reasons that we're proposing within the Brentwood, Darlington, and Mount Scott Arletta. And just a kind of a side note, an R3 designation is something that we inherited from from Multnomah County. So that's a zoning or a designation from Multnomah County. Although these sets of proposals that are highlighted on the map in a few other locations impact about 968 acres, the impact on development capacity of the city is pretty minimal because these are all fairly low density areas to begin with. A principle that we started out back in I would say the kind of the January, February time following the review of the working draft part 2 and the public comments we received at that time was to, as we were moving forward, to treat like situations in like ways. And so since we did hear some feedback in the working draft part 2 that we're calling for these down designations, through our technical analysis and review, we were actually able to bring in many more areas using the same criteria. Again, in the technical analysis, looking at prevailing lot sizes, actual development on the ground, distance from centers and corridors, number of buildable lots, which would, with remaining development capacity under different assumptions, and just to emphasize whether there was existence of sidewalks and other public services. Like Roberta has said with the previous category, we do expect to hear a great deal of testimony from advocates as well as opponents of these proposed changes. Thank you.
Questions? Mike?
Yeah, Deborah's presentation was music to my ears in that what I thought I heard was that by being very strategic about where we're developing, residential and otherwise, that we won't necessarily run into the age-old conversation we've had every time that natural resources are being considered, that, my God, if we protect this, if we protect that, we're going to have to expand the urban growth boundary. And what I heard was we have ample opportunity to achieve both those objectives, better protecting natural resources, although the focus seemed to be on hazard lands. There's a natural resource inventory that I hope we're going to be talking about eventually that would put more protections on not just the publicly owned land, but privately owned land. And what I'm hearing is that we have the opportunity to get out of that, I think, lose-lose conversation we've had over the last 20 or 30 years, that we can't protect natural resources because we may have to expand the urban growth boundary. I'm not talking about industrial lands right now. We can get into that conversation later. So that was good. Is that an accurate understanding of what you presented us?
Yeah, and I would just comment that there's a couple things that relate to our ability to do that. One is that we do have enough residential capacity overall in the city, and that's mostly because the form of that development is occurring as denser, transit-oriented mixed use for the most part. If we were seeing a lot of low-density residential development and not a lot of mixed use, we would have a harder time making this argument. So it's sort of the inverse of the mixed-use project, if you will, that project is what makes this possible.
Did you want to add something?
No, I was going to say, I do have one more slide that goes a little bit further.
Okay. Then to Eric. Yeah, you're going to hear a lot of comments on, I understand that there's still the notion that it'd be 300, 500 split on West Hayden Island, but from my perspective, when I look out 10 or 15 years, when Howard will probably still be here, I probably won't. I don't know if staff will be. But I can tell you my experience in the past has been somebody will point to that map and they'll say West Hayden Island was all designated for jobs according to the blue on this map. And so I already exchanged my concerns with you folks and with PSC, and we can talk about it more later. I just wanted to get it out there that in my opinion, very respectfully, you noted that we basically, through the language and through the map designation, have gone to the status quo, which was, as you described, the city council proclamation, right? In my opinion, the status quo is all the work we did over a year or 2 year period that resulted in a recommendation from the Planning and Sustainability Commission that put very specific requirements on mitigation that would be associated should West Hayden Island be developed. And again, in 5, 10, 15 years, when there's a whole new city council, staff, planning, sustainability commission, people are going to point to that and say, well, you should do some mitigation, and that'll be the end of it. So I don't know how we accomplish conveying to future decision makers, both within the Bureau and at City Council and on this commission, what the intent is now. In my opinion, the status quo is a challenge for us.
Yeah, and as you said, we anticipate a lot of discussion of this as we get into the work sessions this fall. Maybe one thing to just note is that the map app is a communication device, and we simplified the world a little bit to make everything fit into 4 categories. And this was one of those that doesn't quite fit neatly into that category. Right. And so the actual comp plan map is a little different than that and doesn't have the word jobs in front of West Hayden Mountain. So we'll, and again, there will be discussion of the policies that go with that. So.
Right. And then the other thing is, I think actually you responded to this as I was contemplating it. It seems to me there could be more blue up there that would relate to a conversation we had about industrial lands, which was intensification, brownfields and so forth. There wasn't any representation up there. You referenced central east side, and that was the first thing I thought was we've had conversations about, how it actually may generate more jobs in the future. And so I'm just curious, and I didn't hear any reference to brownfields. I assume there's no blue on what brownfields we have up there. Why is that?
Well, the map is a map of land use map changes, so it's not a map of programs for brownfield cleanup, and it's not a map of areas that may be growing but where we didn't change the basic comp plan designation. It also does not include the central city changes yet because there's a separate process for that. So there will be some central city mapping changes that affect the central east side that are part of that process, which are part of the overall math, as you know. There is one category where it is in the map app is the question of freight investments to support better utilization of land use, and there are some specific projects on the map that relate to some of that. But again, we didn't map the brownfield program on the map app, though we do know where brownfields are.
Okay, well, I was just reacting to your distinction between zoning and the comp plan map, which is like what we want to see in the future, and it seemed like we want to see more brownfield development. We want to see more intensification out there.
Yeah, and those areas are already mapped in the comp plan for that, in the existing comp plan.
I think this is one of those things too where if you just read the policies and never looked at the map, or if you just look at the map and don't read the policies, you don't get the whole picture, and you need to do both. And so as you look at each issue, kind of going back and forth on what are the land use changes we're actually proposing, and then what are the policy actions on that land that we're proposing. So you need to kind of look at both.
We'll hope people in the future look at both too. Roberta's presentation, again, it focused on natural hazard lands. I didn't hear reference to floodplains. And it just seems, especially in the face of climate change and what we very highly suspect based on the information we have, the potential for increased floodplains due to more intense events during the winter. Mm-hmm. Seems to me that that's an issue as well, and that, do we just not know enough to include that in your work?
Actually, there are, well, there's at least one area, fairly significant area to the south of Pal Butte. Right. That's part of the proposal. We call it Pal Butte South, and it is in the floodplain. And so, but again, we were looking for the convergence of, and this was with a focus primarily on residential development. A lot of the floodplain that's in the industrial area and commercial area, a down designation, reducing the density isn't exactly the tool. There are other tools we can look at in terms of ecological site design, impervious area issues, and all the other stuff we've been talking about. So much of the west side, streams and stuff don't really have floodplain. They're high gradient streams and so forth. So on the east side, we did look at the Johnson Creek floodplain, and that was the area we felt was the most appropriate for the store. We have a lot of lots that are developable. We can sit down with you and show you kind of the land use pattern, but we had more of a Swiss cheese of development and mix of land uses along the Johnson Creek floodplain. Again, I think it's sort of like necessary but not sufficient, and we are interested in looking at impervious area more directly in areas like the floodplain. The existing Johnson Creek South Subbasin plan does have impervious area limits specific to the floodplain, so we're talking about maybe actually broadening that to other types of situations, if that helps.
I just wanted to wrap up with one more slide about some proposed map changes in East Portland. And Eric already touched on a number of employment-related changes that we're proposing, so I won't go back over those. But we are also proposing a number of residential down designations in East Portland that are specifically designed to reduce some development pressures in places where currently high-density housing is allowed and has to some degree been built in places where the infrastructure hasn't caught up with the density. And so we're finding a mismatch between the density in some of these areas, and it's near 122nd Avenue, near 136th Avenue. We're seeing strains on David Douglas School District in particular, and so we've been working with the school district and looking at the presence or lack of services, and we would like to reduce some of that pressures and allow some of that infrastructure to catch up with the density that's already there. So we're looking at, and as you may already know, East Portland is an area that has about 25% of our population, but 40% of our school-age kids. So we really want to see safe routes to schools. We want to be better matching the development capacity with services, with safe crossings, with school capacity. All these things really need to come together. So we have this opportunity to do some adjustments out in East Portland to accomplish these goals. And as you also may already know, we are working with not just David Douglas School District, but all of our large school districts to sync up facilities planning that the school districts are doing with our comprehensive plan. So we're working with the school districts to make sure we're sharing data about enrollment projections. And in the case of David Douglas School District, they're actively looking for new sites because they, I think, let's see, they have 4 of their 9 elementary schools currently are over their target capacity. And by 2033, 6 of the 9 schools and their high school will be over capacity. So they have a fairly urgent need to locate new sites. So we are consulting with them about that. But we will be having memorandum of understanding and intergovernmental agreements with each of our districts to kind of forge that ongoing relationship through the work with our comprehensive plan and sort of mutual consultation and coordination over time, which I think that you've encouraged us to do over the years, and we're in the process of doing that as one of our early implementation actions that you'll be seeing in the spring. So with that, I think that if there are other questions, we're happy to answer them.
Other questions?
On the school services in East Portland, this isn't a well thought out question, but what's the venue to discuss the policy implications and policy approaches to this problem? Because having 40% of the school kids in, what did you say, 25% of the
25%,
land, something like that?
Something like that.
That probably reflects a socioeconomic pattern of where young families can afford to live. But the overtaxing of the school districts reflects not only that, but probably also the fact that we have a number of independent school districts that may or may not have equitable funding relative to the community. So it seems like there's a potential for holding down development there to be a relatively short-term kind of stopgap approach, and there's perhaps some broader approaches around how do we educate kids, how do we create affordable housing in a more dispersed fashion. And so I'm just wondering, where do we get to that conversation? Or do we get to have that conversation and all, or where does that conversation
It's really too
happen?
bad Karen isn't here for this, because she loves talking about this. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, there's probably 2, as Susan said earlier, that it's helpful to kind of have the policies and the maps kind of out and look back and forth between them. But the housing policies and the public facilities policies both kind of address this in terms of housing supply and housing design, in terms of family-friendly housing in other areas in the central neighborhoods. And then also in the public facilities chapter, by defining public schools as a public facility, it kind of changes the game in terms of its relationship to land use. So I would encourage you to read those policies, and then there is a forum to discuss those policies and what that means towards your question, I think.
Okay, thank you. And I just had one comment, an expression of appreciation. First of all, just for the good for the good presentation, but also as a person who's pretty severely deaf, I really appreciated the fact that you plugged the computer into the sound system so that I could hear and the other people who are hearing impaired could hear what was going on in the video. Really appreciate that.
Other questions? I have, I guess it's a concern, and it's about what I think are conflicting policies. When you look at the transportation policy and the investment policy that we have actually in the Portland plan, we talk about East Portland and the direction to invest from a public infrastructure standpoint on sidewalks, transit, to make better connections between the expected expansion of population and the jobs and those people. And then we just heard that because of the lack of sidewalks in that infrastructure, we're downzoning or taking out that capacity. My policy kind of question is, because we're taking out the capacity, we have a transportation system policy that is saying, we're going to go to those areas that have the higher density as a priority to make that investment. And so now we're taking density out, and the people that are caught in the middle are the people that with the lower density but still don't have sidewalks in East Portland that are not going to be prioritized at the higher to get the sidewalks in East Portland. So how do we tell the, I mean, we got to tell the transportation policy guys and the transit folks too, because the transit is linked to the sidewalks, that we need to get these people to a sidewalk so they can get to the closest center in an equitable way. And how do we, policy-wise, when you look at the map, there's no sidewalks there, I get that. And when you look at the density where we've located density, we have a higher density in other areas that are going to get prioritized because of our policy about transit and sidewalk investment. That's our public infrastructure dollars. How do we balance those two?
I think we're doing at least two things to balance that or walk that fine line. One is that we're not taking away all the growth on these places. There's still quite a bit of growth potential on 122nd Avenue, for example. And there's already quite a bit of density already out there that's already happened. So we're making small downward adjustments to reduce the pace in the future, but there's still going to be transit supportive density on that, on 122nd. The second piece is we're making much more explicit in the policy that the investment policy is not merely just linking investment with density, but it's also explicitly dealing with the equity mismatch as a second strategy. So it's a dual investment strategy of, invest in transit-oriented places and where the density is going, but also explicitly have a second track that's catching up those places that aren't caught up.
Okay, I don't see that linkage in the language right now, but I'll take another look at it because just the public infrastructure, the investment strategy, when you look at the list of projects, sidewalks are clearly listed. We haven't seen how they're going to prioritize that, but the policy clearly goes to the higher density, the connected neighborhoods, and the ones that have that sidewalk investment that then follow with the transit and all that. So I'll take another look.
Part of that too is you all are going to have, maybe just a dozen big questions like that, but maybe 7 dozen big questions like that. I'm not sure yet. I'm hopeful for a smaller number, but on issues like this, we can really pull it apart for you to make it easier to really look at the policy issues and where on the map and how much are we actually looking at downzoning, how, what is the impact? Because big generalized statements, whether it's about the environment or jobs or this issue, I think will be actually harmful to the process versus helping you get down to what it is we're actually proposing. So we'll help you do that, and we'll make sure that we have really simple, like, some of the handouts you have here that help you get to the key points of what we're trying to do.
Well, I think it's important, though, and I agree, it's a broad statement, just looking at the language in here that says, we're not, it says pursue infrastructure and improvements. And so the statement that because there's no sidewalks, we're gonna go down is a broad statement, but at the end of the day, transportation is pretty adamant about their little prioritization, and if they've been on the committee, they don't see the sidewalks, they're moving on. And I don't want them to move on. I want them to make that investment in the sidewalk and give those people an opportunity to use transit, because that's another critical part of our strategy for climate change and a number of other issues. So it's linked, and so the broad statements are the big policy things, and I don't know. So I appreciate if you can break it down and show me those linkages, I guess, a little bit better, or if there's a way to strengthen it.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Other questions? Oh, great, thanks.
We'll touch on that in the mixed use briefing.
Next, we have Central City 2035 West Quadrant Plan. But before I wanted to do that, as a reminder, and Susan really brought it up, that if we can, as commissioners, we have these statements or questions, to get them into staff early, get them to Julie, Eric, whoever, and so that they can break them down for us and give us some better answers, and a better explanation. So when we get to the work session, we kind of have a lot of those things explained to us, or if we still have questions, they're hopefully not as broad as mine were. So to start the Central City 2035 briefing, I'll allow Catherine, who is on the committee of vice chair, to open that up, and then we'll have a briefing by Carl.
So first of all, just want to start with an amazing job that Carl and his team did with this process. There were, I think as some of the documentation says, like 33 of us on the committee. It's a large committee, a lot of diverse opinions, a lot of great different backgrounds and points of view. We had 16 different meetings, and it's kind of surprising that 16 meetings is a lot of meetings, but it tackled a ton of area in 16 meetings. So they did a great job at kind of keeping us all moving forward. So we had a number of kind of, I would say, big ideas that came out of it, and just a few of them, as there was a lot of discussion about the riverfront and the Willamette and how to perhaps look at better ways to activate might be one of them, or better ways to integrate a variety of uses in the waterfront, yet still obviously be very respectful to the natural habitat that's there. A green loop concept, which is pedestrian bike loop throughout the city. Capping of 405 came up again, and a couple of and I say again, meaning it's been in other discussions previously, but in a couple of different areas of town, both between Goose Hollow and kind of West End, as well as between like PSU and kind of Barber, that connection there. One of my favorites, as well as the riverfront kind of activation, was a Times Square on Burnside and concept, and that got some play. I wouldn't say a huge long discussion, but it was certainly of interest to a lot of people. And that's just a few of the highlights. There's some great ideas that came out of that. In general, I would say the committee had pretty good consensus moving forward with what's being presented today by Carl. There were, I think there was a tally of the votes that was sent out here, and I will say by our last meeting, there were 16 meetings. We didn't quite have everyone there, but we did have enough of a quorum, and had enough certainly moving forward to feel like we had great consensus with what was being presented. Some concerns that came out, I think you guys just got them today, and I've highlighted for you before, that have been expressed are strengthening of the environmental goals within the document. And I think in all fairness to Carl's team, there was some very quick pulling together and not a lot of time to be able to explain to the committee how things got moved around and got shifted around. I think some of that's being reflected in the concerns that we have in the report, but I'm sure Carl will address that more. There was a fair amount of discussion on the committee regarding building heights and what's appropriate, especially with regards to West End. But, you know, again, I think that the committee as a group, they listened, they heard it, but they felt what's being proposed here made sense. And then also historical, a lot of testimony and discussion regarding historical preservation and a need to maybe look at that holistically throughout the city. And those are just kind of a highlight of some of the concerns that came out of it. And happy to talk with any of you if you kind of want to go into more depth with, after the briefing, with anything I heard.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your service on that. 16
Absolutely.
meetings, a lot.
We got great pizza dinners. It was fabulous.
Carl?
It's amazing what you can do with a little pizza
Pizza,
in
yeah.
this town, you know?
Carl, you're, Sally.
Actually, I think I'll start. Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Sally Edmonds, and I'm the manager of the Central City River and Environmental Planning teams. And I just want to tell you that we are just so pleased to be here to present this to you today. It's, as Kat's mentioned, it's taken a lot of work to get to where we are here, and I just want to personally acknowledge the different staff who have worked so hard over the last number of years, and starting with Carl, who has done just a tremendous job keeping all the pieces together as things went forward. Catherine Hardinger, who's doing double duty today in Julie's seat, Nicholas Starrin, Debbie Bischoff, Mindy Brooks, Mark Raggett, Laura Lillard, Mauricio Leclerc from PBOT, Vin Mason and Michelle Krim for some of the climate work, some staff who have left, Steve Iwata and others, people from other bureaus, Parks, PDC, BES, and of course our co-chairs, Kat and Karen Williams, and then Susan and Joe, who have been with us through this too. This afternoon, we're going to give you just a brief overview of the Central City 2035. Then Carl will dive into the West Quadrant Plan overview, talk about a few of the issues you're likely to hear about at the hearing, some of which Kat just mentioned to you. We'll go over some next steps going forward, and then go into some questions and discussion. You are just receiving the document today, so this is really kind of an introduction to the document for you. So as you know, the Central City 2035 project is an update of the 1972 plan that sort of set the stage for what downtown is today, and that's the image on your left. The 1988 plan expanded on that planning to the area that we now basically consider the Central City, and that's the image on your right. So the Central City is about 3,000 acres. It makes up 3.2% of the city, but is currently home to 24,000 households, and we are expecting 30,000 more households by 2035. It's currently home to 130,000 jobs, and we are expecting 35% of the city's growth in jobs. That's another 49,000 jobs. So, as you also know, the Central City 2035 project builds on the Portland Plan and the Comprehensive Plan. We're taking this project forward in pieces. Several years ago, you heard about the concept plan, which is kind of a high-level policy plan. We have since been working quadrant by quadrant. Several years ago, you also heard the North-Northeast quadrant plan. You're hearing the West Quadrant plan today, and we expect to bring you the Southeast quadrant plan in December, January of next year. So the concept plan set forth this strategic direction to position Portland Central City as a globally recognized center of equity, innovation, and exchange. And so that's kind of the basis that, that all these quadrant plans are working from. So I'll turn it over to Carl.
Great. Thanks, Sally. Let's see if I can. Okay, so, yeah. Whoa, questions, right away. This one?
Position Portland as a globally recognized center of equity, innovation, exchange, and Portland is also a center of creativity and of emerging job growth around that word. I don't want to focus on it, but be general about it. And I'm kind of concerned that get involved in this definition, that we're more than just this, which I certainly think we need to be, but we're also a central city that's globally recognized as a center of excellence in creativity. And we have a lot of landmarks of that right now with going into it, and we're going to get more. So I wonder if that couldn't be worked into that comment.
Sure, and I think that's a great point, and I just would like to point out that the concept plan has a lot more in it than that sentence. And we can take another look at that. And one of the things that we need to do over the next year as we get kind of past these quadrant plans is take another look at that concept plan and make sure that we have the right set of policies for the whole central city as we put the final sort of new central city plan together. So it's a great point to be reminded of. Okay, so west quadrant. So this is the area we're dealing with. So from the Riverscape area up at Terminal 1 South here at the north of the Pearl District, which is actually part of Northwest District's association area, all the way down to the bottom of South Waterfront and over to Goose Hollow and everything within the freeway loop there as well. So that's the area we're dealing with. For the purpose of this plan, you'll find things organized into these 7 districts. They're a little bit different than the previous sub-districts that we had. Some of the changes that we've made, some tweaks to the boundaries, we actually called West End out as a separate place to have a bit of a separate conversation, make some room for that, rather than just including it in downtown. Rather than having a very small university district here focused just on the traditional campus, as the university has grown and other things have started to happen kind of in and around this southern part of the downtown, we decided to look at that whole area south of Market, that it starts to have some similarities in terms of large blocks and car-free areas and things like that, transportation challenges. So we kind of looked at that area as one place that's new, slightly different. And then the other bigger change is that we used to talk about everything north of Burnside as part of the River District, and we're actually reflecting now that there are 2 pretty distinctly different neighborhood communities there. And there's certainly some synergies between them, absolutely. We don't want to suggest that they're separate. But that there are some pretty separate policy conversations that needed to happen around the Pearl District versus Old Town Chinatown. So those are reflected now in the districts.
Carl, a question before you leave the map.
You guys are full of questions. It's great. This may take, okay, yeah.
So my understanding is at the beginning of this process, there was some consideration of including some of the eastern precincts of NWDA.
Oh, yeah,
I assume there was a choice not to do that.
There was. So back to this one. This is the Central City 2035 plan area map. And on that northeast, I'll remind you of the northeast quadrant conversation. There are 2 areas in northeast that were actually outside the central city, remain outside the central city. But because of the freeway project that we were dealing with as part of that, and just sort of some synergies around zoning and issues, we included them in that planning process. We had an earlier version of this map that included some of the areas around Conway, most notably, and it actually at one point included some of the stuff in the kind of Kelly Triangle sort of area. So those areas were dropped from the Central City process. They were done intentionally. Conway primarily because that project and those decisions and some of those big moves moved forward on a separate quasi-judicial process, and really trying to deal with them now at a legislative level didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. So that stuff is happening now, development's going on. They move forward with their own master plan. And down here, there were so many complications around future transportation. And frankly, the Oregon Department of Transportation has participated a little bit in the West Quadrant, but to really be able to figure this area out, we need them fully at the table, I think, like we had them in Northeast, and they're just not ready to do that yet. So we didn't feel like we could get very far with this area of town unless we really had them at the table, because so much of that is regional transportation infrastructure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, going the wrong way, here we go. Okay. planning process. So 17 months of working with our stakeholder advisory committee, which Kat helped us chair. 16 meetings, lots of conversation, countless thousands of hours by lots of different people. That just wanted to point out on the stakeholder advisory committee that we had an open application process for that. We had around 100 applicants for what ended up being 33 positions. Not everybody could be on it. We tried very hard to be very impartial and open about who got there, and we felt like the results were pretty good. But just so you know, it was, there probably are one or two hard feelings out there about people who would have been great on the committee, and we tried to control the size. 33 is still a very big committee. Okay, so I want to talk about the plan. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing. You've got it. It's a big one. There's a lot of good stuff in here, covering a big area with a lot of interesting things and ideas. And you'll have the next few weeks to go through it. And I would encourage you, since you just got it now, and I'm sure you don't have all your questions ready, except for Mike, I'm sure he has his questions ready, but everybody else doesn't have their questions ready for us. So as you kind of come to them over the next few weeks, if you have questions, clarifying questions, it's great if you want to contact us directly, and we can hopefully answer some of those. So highlights from the chapters. So here's how it's organized. We got a summary, executive summary, introduction, we got a background section, it's very short, section on how we kind of ran through the process. We've got the sort of meat and potatoes of the plan, chapters 4 and 5, the goals, policies, and actions, both at a central citywide level, guidance to going back to that conversation that Commissioner Shapiro was just alluding to about needing to take another look at the central citywide policies and what we have there, and then district level ones in chapter 5 as well. So
let me just interject for a second, because some people here are new to the commission and some have done 4,000 other things since the last time they dealt with the Central City Plan. So the way we're doing this process is that we adopted by resolution at City Council the Northeast Quadrant Plan and the overall concept plan. So it's not by ordinance yet. And we're doing this sort of as an iterative process. So we're doing Northeast, we're doing the West Quadrant, and then we're doing Southeast. And in each one, we're learning things that, oh, we should have that kind of a policy backup in the first one. I don't think we're going to make wholesale changes back up in the Northeast Quadrant Plan, but we're learning things as we go, and we're trying to take those. If we hadn't done that, and we tried to do it all at one time, we would have never, we didn't have the staff to do it that way, so we've decided to kind of do it in circular kind of motion. Some of the issues that we found out by digging into the details kind of resulted in big ideas, especially around environmental issues, some job issues that we want to take back up to the concept plan. So we're going to be looking at amending that too. So at each one of these stages, your job is to make a recommendation to City Council. Their job will be then to adopt it by resolution, and then by next fall, we will have put it all back together, and bring it to you to provide your recommendation to City Council for them to adopt by ordinance. And so it then becomes sort of with the comprehensive plan and more or less a part of the comprehensive plan, and there'll be zoning changes and all those kinds of things that fall out of it then. So absolutely be concerned with details now that are important to you, but those details may not be all in there right now. And so we know that already. But still begin to pull them out, and so our process now will be to make sure that we highlight, we know what those issues are, but it may be next summer before every bit of those details are back in the plan in terms of the solutions. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. Good.
we have a slide about that at the end too, but.
I didn't want to wonder.
Yeah, let's do it now. It's better to get it out. So, okay, so chapter 1 has quite a few things in it, but the thing that I wanted to pull out was this section on these big ideas. And these are sort of big themes that came out as early in the process as we were coming up with ideas and issues and thinking of how things could be different and exciting over the next 20 years. They're reflected throughout the document, but one of the criticisms we got with earlier drafts is that they started to feel kind of lost in the hundreds and hundreds of other action items and policy statements and things dealing with other important things that weren't maybe at the same level of these sort of big, more all-encompassing ideas. So they're called out here, and they are this renewed and not new, but definitely renewed interest and excitement about the urban river, the riverfront, the opportunity to do something really exciting, urban, right along the river to bring that interface of the sort of human city to the natural city to the water all together in kind of an exciting and new way. Was really what that was about. And so a lot of people were excited about this for a lot of different reasons. Some for the habitat opportunity reasons, some for recreational opportunities, some because of development opportunities and creating new communities. So lots of different facets to this idea, but the general kind of perception that that this is an aspiration that does show up in previous planning documents, and it's one that we have kind of fallen a little bit short on. That while our waterfront is a great resource, it isn't certainly everything it could be in the context of a 21st century, vibrant, growing city. So that shows up in quite a few places. This green loop idea, so this is kind of a new notion of kind of a trail-like linear open space that would run through really the heart of the city. So something that would be as pleasant to move along as perhaps the Greenway Trail. Yeah, and actually this idea is described in some detail in the appendix. It's an appendix F, I think it is, sort of towards the back. There's a little 10-page, appendix E, sorry, write-up about this green loop idea, so you can see more about it there. But this was something that got a fair amount of traction. You could build perhaps on the existing alignment of the North and South Park blocks, and then begin to create some important connections and improvements within there to make that kind of work as more of a seamless way to move people through alternative modes, not just a transportation idea, but all kinds of potential benefits associated with this, including economic development, and tourism, business location. It's been called kind of an analog to the streetcar loop in some ways, perhaps. So there's a lot of different ways you could go with this, but it's pretty interesting. You'll notice this cloud over the Central East Side. That's something that you'll be getting to talk about when the Southeast Quadrant comes to you in a few months.
That's the veil of secrecy?
Well, no, it's not so much secrecy. We just really don't know. So I think, yeah, right. It's under there. Or it's not under there, I guess they would say, right? So anyway, we didn't want to presume, so we didn't do that. Another is this notion of this mixed-use quadrant. Maybe that doesn't sound very exciting, but as we, and I'll talk about these layers a little bit, but as we started to think about, are there predominant land uses, what's kind of the land use or zoning kind of emphasis or pattern in the West Quadrant, we pretty quickly realized that the beauty of the West Quadrant is it's very flexible and very mixed, and that our most successful districts perhaps are the ones that have the biggest kind of mix of different kinds of uses all together, adding to that vibrancy in all their different kind of ways. So the Pearl District is a great example of a place where we're very open in terms of our regulatory framework, in terms of uses, and it's been quite successful. That's not the only reason, but it's certainly part of the package there. So you see that emphasis kind of throughout. And there are a number of actions throughout the plan that relate to trying to be more mixed and more open to different types of uses in more places. So there are quite a few places where we're actually looking at lifting some existing restrictions and being a little bit more flexible with regard to uses in the West Quadrant. Goose Hollow is one of those examples, and so there's a little map of it there. And this is a kind of a map of existing uses in the West End and showing that great mix of green is this residential, and there's office, and there's commercial, and there's institutional, and there's the art museums. There's all kinds of things all mixed together, and it really starts to work pretty well. This is, so Kat mentioned this. This is the notion of Times Square for Portland, perhaps, is if there's a Main and Main in Portland, it could very well be Burnside and Broadway, sort of the two main thoroughfares. They come together in what today is a somewhat forgettable place, perhaps. So this notion was, well, maybe it could really be something over the long term, something quite different that we could celebrate, something very exciting. And so that is in there as a notion. Another one is an oldie but a goodie, so freeway capping, right? So this idea of could we begin to build parks or urban fabric or whatever over the divide of I-405, and we could. From a technical perspective, it is definitely possible. Other places have done it, they're doing it. There's still a lot of aspiration here about doing it. I think it's a little bit more targeted and specific than perhaps it was in the past, and that's kind of what this map that came out of the charrette is kind of trying to get to. There's different nodes where you might want to make the leap to actually looking at freeway capping or building over that trench in the freeway for different reasons. So, for example, maybe at Burnside for connectivity reasons, it's a difficult place to cross if you're a pedestrian or a bicycle. Along the light rail lines at Morrison and Yamhill, perhaps for a kind of a city building, urban fabric kind of retail environment reason, you might want to do it. At Lincoln High School, perhaps you would do it for an open space amenity. So that kind of thing. Maybe not everywhere, and it will be expensive. And there's probably no clear champion for this idea today, but there's a lot of excitement about it and hope that over the long term, it'll become more economically viable and begin to happen. So that takes us to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is about background. We did include a fairly lengthy section on history of the West Quadrant. I want to reiterate this is an update of our existing long-range plans, the 88 plan. So we also included a short section on the sort of previous planning history. In addition, you'll see a little picture of the North Pearl District Plan cover there. That's a fairly recent planning effort. We went into this effort not wanting to start from scratch, so that was a project some of you were probably on the commission when it came through and was adopted in, I think, 2008 or 9. So those recent policy documents that seem quite valid, we really wanted to just translate into this new document and not start from scratch on things like that. So that's what Chapter 2 is about. It's fairly short, it's sweet, it's a good one. And then Chapter 3. So this is, what do we do? How do we do this? We went through this large process of generating ideas, presenting information, issues. We had several different types of community forums, some focused on specific districts. We had charrettes and specific targeted outreach in Goose Hollow and in Old Town Chinatown, where we knew there were some bigger questions that perhaps needed to be talked about in a little bit more in depth than in some other areas. And then we had an entire week where we spent working with our stakeholder advisory committee and others and partners from other bureaus on a charrette for the sort of the whole quadrant and trying to put those ideas together. We generated many dozens of maps like these ones that you see there. And then essentially took those to move forward into two kind of major products in this phase. One, a set of urban design principles, and one series of system-oriented maps at the quadrant-wide scale. So these are the urban design principles. So there's 8 of them. There's a notion about strengthening places, which is really about trying to make sure that all sort of, while the West Quadrant works very well as sort of one larger urban core kind of area, it actually is made up of very many distinctively different and hopefully successful kind of micro places. And that over time, and today, some of them are identifiable and successful and others are perhaps not. And over the next 20 years, it'd be nice to move towards more of them being really sort of full communities on their own and being successful. There's one about embracing the river. We've talked about that a little bit. Connecting places. So really the Green Loop is reflected there, but also the connections to and from the Green Loop. It's only as good as it can be if you can get to and from it, and the Greenway Trail. Designing with nature, ideas about trying to integrate more of that into the built form. Yes, it's a very dense urban environment, but there are a lot of interesting and exciting opportunities to bring natural elements into that as it grows and evolves. Expanding housing opportunities. Housing is essentially allowed and encouraged pretty much everywhere in the West Quadrant, and that's going to continue. Growing employment, so that reflecting the regional role of the Central City, both now and in the future, as a major employment center and a center for innovation and exchange, trying to keep us going. Expanding the retail core, perhaps, so it's kind of expanding now up into the sort of, up to the Burnside area and up into the lower part of the Pearl District, and ideally bringing it down to the river as well over time. And then this idea about shaping the skyline. Are there particular nodes where signature architecture of a different scale sort of begin to help form the image of the city? And this is one that is not universally loved, but it is one of our urban design principles. So then we had, and you can't see these are in Chapter 3, if you'd like to refer to them, but there are 10 of these system layer maps. So the top 6 are kind of around land use and development issues. So there's a land use one, there's a sort of special places, character defining districts, elements, things like that. There's one on scale, sort of building height and scale, where are the tallest buildings allowed. You can see the transit mall there in the middle, and we'll come back and talk about that. And you'll hear lots and lots about that at the hearing. There's one on street and development character, which, if you may remember this notion from the Northeast Quadrant Plan, but this is trying to be a little bit more intentional and hierarchical about our street network. We have small blocks, so we have a lot of streets. We tend to treat them from an urban design perspective, by and large, the same today. And this is trying to move slightly beyond that and have a little bit more clear aspiration about one street versus another, from a retail perspective or a green perspective or even a transportation perspective. There's one about parks and open spaces, both existing and desired additional open spaces and connections to and between them. And there's one about green systems, which is sort of a map that has generated lots of good conversation. And Kat she's not a fan, so ask Kat if you know. This map, I think the best value of this map is that it's a reminder that there are a whole lot of systems and a lot of things that we've learned since the last time that we updated these planning documents around the sort of green development and environmental performance spectrum of issues that we didn't know anything about in the mid-1980s. And so some of them can be mapped and are sort of thrown on here with ideas like district energy and stormwater management corridors and habitat corridors and rainwater collecting and reharvesting and things like that. But a lot of this really can't be mapped. And so it's a good placeholder and reminder, and some of it's there, but it's definitely something we want to make sure we integrate into a final plan document. And then the bottom four are modal transportation maps. And Mauricio Leclerc's in the audience here. If you have specific questions about those, we can drag him up. Or if you want to talk to him in the weeks before the hearing, you can certainly do that as well. But he helped us develop these. And these, again, are an opportunity to be a little bit more intentional within the West Quadrant about how our transportation system functions. And so you have a map on transit, sort of identifying key transit corridors, transit ways. You have one on pedestrian movement, one on vehicle and freight movement, and that's the one with this purple octopus that sort of hangs out at the bottom of the central city here, which is really the needed project to work with ODOT at some point in the future to figure out improvements to that section of regional infrastructure along the 405, where I-5 and 405 and 26 and 99 and 43 all come together into a nice little sort of elegant automotive situation and create all kinds of problems that we'd like to straighten out. So, and then finally bicycles. And bicycles is the one that today probably is the least well developed. So there's some pretty exciting ideas about this bicycle map and the beginnings of a kind of coherent desired future basic system network for bicycles within the West Quadrant of the Central City. As I said before, there's lots of streets. Right? We got lots and lots of streets, many more streets than most cities, most central cities. If you look at the amount of the land area in the West Quadrant or in our downtown, essentially, that's devoted to public right-of-way, it's about 40%. A city like San Francisco is about 25%. So a very big difference there. That is expensive for us to maintain, but it also creates some wonderful opportunities in terms of perhaps not needing it all for one mode or another, and being able to, because the streets are so close together, be a little bit more hierarchical and specific and devote maybe more of one street to one thing versus another, and get a system, basic network that works for all of them together without trying to accommodate everything in every street, because our streets are fairly small. So that's kind of what that stuff is about. Pretty interesting. Chapter 4. So all of that stuff led to the policy documents, so the goals, policies, and actions that are in Chapter 4 and 5. Really, that work led us directly into conversations at a district level, which is Chapter 5. But as we did that work, and I think as Susan was saying, we began to realize that in certain topic areas, most of the things that were kind of coming out and we were talking about in these different districts were things that we actually needed to say about the entire central city. And that's particularly true in areas around environment, in areas around housing and affordable housing policies. We really didn't have something different to say about Pearl District versus Goose Hollow. It was kind of the same statement and it kind of kept repeating itself. So we brought that stuff up and added it to this Chapter 4. Chapter 4 includes the as-adopted policy language from the concept plan that you might remember, and then which are in gray boxes. And then it also adds the things that have come out of this conversation that are relevant to the central city as a whole, and we've added them there. So that's kind of what this chapter is about. There's a lot of important stuff in here. In a lot of ways, this actually will have more weight at the end of the day than a district level statement, perhaps. But this has been confusing and caused some confusion, and frankly, it's a little bit confusing to us too. But we think it'll work, and it gives us good guidance for updating the concept plan policies over the next year. It is a work in progress. Like it says in the introduction of Chapter 4, and I've got in here in big letters, this is definitely still a moving kind of a target. But many of the things that were very important to certain constituencies got into this section, but not into the district sections because it was being repeated. So Chapter 5, then, is the 7 districts with each of their short goal statements, which are really the goals in this case, the way we've kind of done that following the lead of the Northeast Quadrant Plan, are short kind of aspirational statements of mini visions for those districts in the future. They're followed by a couple of clear and simple kind of diagrams illustrating kind of the big moves and major features in the districts, and then a series of policies organized into different topic areas Actually, the Willamette River came out of these. I should have taken that out. The Willamette River stuff ended up in Central City wide. So it ended up in Chapter 4 because it was in multiple districts as well. So it's actually not in this district section, so you won't see it there. But the others are, and they're loosely based on the topic headings from the concept plan. We're trying to have some continuity there. And then there's a series of actions, many hundreds of them, actually. And then some provisional performance targets. The performance targets are another area that we know we need to kind of come back to once over the next years, we get a little bit more information in some cases about what we might be able to measure or want to measure, but also as we look at the whole Central City and start to add things up and figure out what is a reasonable Central City-wide kind of target. So within that, I've got these slides. I actually have one for each of the 7. I think I want to not spend a whole lot of time on these, but maybe I'll just do a couple as examples. But so in the downtown, you see, so there's the sort of the highlights from the little district goal, and then there's a couple of maps, and so these are sort of the big kind of character areas. So here you can really see, if you're familiar with it, the 72 downtown plan reflected on these 2 maps kind of together for the downtown, and really those basic ideas of the high density office core with surrounding the transit mall, bisected by the retail core, with an exciting something different along the water and something different along the kind of park blocks frontages is what we're talking about there. And then on the right, this is where you can start to see the street and development character hierarchy stuff coming out. And I apologize that these are in black and white, but they are. For some of these maps that are hard, we can get you color copies of them, or we can I think we've posted the whole thing online in color too, so if there's a particular map you'd really like to see in color, we can find it online or we can get it to you. It's a big document, so we can save a lot by doing it in black and white. But yeah, so here you can see that some of the hierarchy, and so the transit mall is kind of showing as blue streets. So those should be great. They are clearly great streets, great for other reasons perhaps than contiguous retail kind of shopping streets. But Broadway clearly shows up, and Morrison and Yamhill as sort of the major kind of civic corridors where you expect the most kind of sidewalk activity and contiguous retail, things like that. Down at the southern end of downtown, there's a series of these boulevard streets, these blue streets, which all have a pretty heavy traffic impact today. But there's some desire to try to make them better places through landscaping, through setbacks, through great building design, things like that. So they're kind of showing up there. West End, just do a couple more of these. So West End, for the character districts in the West End, this northern part really is kind of functionally part of the retail core with a lot of mixed uses, a bunch of office, hotels, all kinds of entertainment stuff going on, very vibrant place. Once you get south of Salmon, it is a little bit more of a predominantly high-density residential district, and there's some desires to continue that, at least not exclusively. It wouldn't be a mono-use district, but to at least continue to express a preference for residential development in the future. So that's kind of what's reflected on that map. And then you can see some of the street hierarchy moves here as well, with a focus on 10th Avenue as sort of a main corridor, an important civic corridor through that district. And Salmon Street showing up as something different, sort of a one-of-a-kind opportunity. Salmon Street kind of kept showing up because it really leads you from the Rose Gardens at Washington Park all the way to Salmon Street Springs in Washington, in Waterfront Park. So that's kind of a pretty exciting, 2 signature sort of places connection. It does have some traffic on it, does have a traffic roll, but it's not humongous. There was kind of a desire to take that to kind of another level through innovative design and let it be a lot of different things. A really signature kind of different experience there, connecting multiple different districts in the West Quadrant. And I'll just do Goose Hollow, and then I'll stop doing these. So Goose Hollow then is a great one, and Goose Hollow is really fun to work on. In many ways, it's wonderfully situated. It's got a lot of great amenities in it. It hasn't seen the kind of development activity over the last decade that we've seen in some other districts, Pearl District, for example. But in many ways, the kind of engaged community there is kind of excited about it and ready for it. So you kind of have this vision of a mixed-use, retail-oriented, not sort of mid-rise kind of corridor on Burnside, and then you've got this kind of really mixed-use, fairly high-density opportunity development area with a lot of development sites within it in what they call the sort of flats of Goose Hollow, essentially on the east side of 18th. Then you got the kind of the big institutions of the stadium and the Mac Club and Lincoln High School here kind of ringing around that. And then you have a more sort of medium density, kind of more residential focused area. And then around Collins Circle. And Collins Circle kept coming up as a really interesting focal point for this district that could really become the sort of nexus for and the sort of growth point for an evolving Jefferson Main Street. And that Jefferson over time could become really kind of the district's core hub of sort of a mixed use Main Street, neighborhood Main Street kind of place. So that's a big shift from existing policy, which was put in place at the time that the West Side Light Rail was built, and the idea was to really try and get that Main Street environment happening around 18th, where the light rail runs. And I think over time it's become increasingly evident that that's probably not going to happen, just given the kinds of land uses and things that are along 18th and that environment, and that 18th maybe could be a great street in other ways, but that it probably isn't going to be your really active contiguous retail Main Street. Okay, I'm going to skip through Pearl, Old Town Chi-Town, South Waterfront, South Downtown University, and come to this one, which is, okay, so you have all those district maps, policies, goals, actions, targets. What would it all look like? Are we talking about, does everything need to get completely developed to accommodate this kind of growth? And what this essentially does, so this is kind of existing, all those existing buildings, all kind of, this is really cool stuff that our urban design studio is putting out. But this is essentially new development that would represent the kind of growth numbers that we're talking about if you add them all up for the different districts in the West Quadrant. So, and I think the takeaway here is that, yeah, it's a lot of development and a lot of new people, but there's a lot of capacity as well. And it doesn't mean, and shouldn't mean, and really can't mean, if we're successful with our plans, that we have to take down all the smaller, older buildings to get there. So that's certainly not the intent. So you have some larger, big opportunity areas like the north part of the Pearl District, essentially blank slates to work with, some other opportunities around the Morrison Bridgehead, for example, and then sporadic kind of infill development throughout. Of course, South Waterfront is, completely unrecognizable. It's a brand new district in 20 years. So that puts in a little bit of context. So, and then the appendices, we have Appendix A is additional details on many of the actions. So as you're going through here and you find an action in one of these action charts and it's an interesting one and it has a little asterisk by it, that means that there's more information, a little bit more write-up, some background context, maybe some maps that help explain it in Appendix A. Height maps are Appendix B, and I'll talk about those in a second. We have a short existing conditions section. That was not our entire existing conditions report. We actually did that a few years ago, and we can get you that as well. That was called the sub-district profiles, and that has much more extensive information if you're looking for a specific piece of data or information there. We have a public involvement summary, kind of adding up all the outreach that we did and how all that worked, and there's a list of the stakeholder advisory committee members in there as well you could be interested in. There's the Green Loop appendix I already mentioned. And then there's a map. This is essentially a map, which is a central reach of the Willamette River draft urban design concept, which captures many of the sort of interesting ideas around the river. So what I wanted to do now, briefly, and I'll do this as quickly as I can, but these are things that you're likely to hear quite a bit about leading up to and at the hearing. Building heights generally, many tall buildings are allowed and in fact encouraged in the Central City and in the West Quadrant in particular. That is not something everybody finds super agreeable. So we're gonna talk about that a lot. There's a few other things I wanted to point out here as well, and I'm gonna do it kind of quickly. But so building heights generally, we started hearing that there was a notion that we really shouldn't perhaps be encouraging or allowing tall, particularly residential buildings, almost a year ago now, sort of last fall, as we were kind of getting into the plan development stage of the process with our stakeholder advisory committee. And people started saying, oh, that's really interesting. Why do we allow tall buildings and how does that work? And staff put together a little memo back in November of last year, kind of framing up how we kind of regulate building height and kind of why we do it and why it's kind of allowed here and there and not other places. And essentially, these broad objectives, and there's 6 of them on here, and if you're interested in this, we can get you that memo for sure. But essentially, we regulate height to accommodate higher levels of development appropriate and desired by the city and regional policy in the region's urban core and transit hub. So once you get above a certain kind of density level, such as we actually have on the books in the kind of core of the West Quadrant, it's difficult to get there without some pretty significant height limits. It isn't to say you can't build dense communities with low height limits. You can, but to get to, particularly with our urban farm and small blocks, some of the levels that we encourage in the core, really in the downtown West End area, you really do need more height to be able to get there. We regulate height to preserve light, air, visual access to parks, open space in the river, to be compatible with designated historic districts and other special design areas, to protect identified public views. We don't regulate height to protect private views. We've never done that. But we do certainly protect a public view corridor from a public place of a public thing, like Mount Hood from the Rose Garden, for example. To create respectful transitions to adjacent less intense neighborhoods and districts, and to help create a memorable and attractive skyline and enrich the city's urban farm and, frankly, image, are some of the reasons that sort of at a broad level that we regulate and allow tall buildings in much of the central city. So I put this up just because I wanted to make it clear that, you know, as we've started to hear about these concerns about height and these ideas that perhaps we could be a much shorter city and that could be beneficial, we did respond to it, and we did actually talk about it with our stakeholder advisory committee at some length last fall. The committee, by and large, wasn't particularly interested with spending a lot more time on it, so we kind of moved on. Many folks did not move on, and you're going to hear about that, and which is fine. I mean, I'm not dismissing them. I'm just saying we tried to move on. So on those height maps, so these are the district West Quadrant height maps. These existing height maps, the darker are sort of where taller buildings are allowed, and they're not exactly the same kind of maps, but you can kind of see the patterns. Transit Mall kind of in the middle, downtown core, darker, taller buildings. And then our proposed kind of map on the right. And it's a little bit more conceptual because it's not the final height map. We haven't done the scenic resources inventory and figured out the views, and we haven't figured out what we're going to do around all of our open spaces, and there's a few pieces missing. But at a conceptual level, that's our proposal on the right. How many changes does it have from the existing? Not all that many. So these yellow circles are the places where we've proposed increasing heights, and they're all a little different. They're for different reasons. So for example, this is an idea about the transit mall is much longer than it used to be. Light rail comes all the way down to Portland State now. Perhaps that basic idea of allowing some taller buildings along the transit mall is a good idea, and we could extend that to the south. So that's what that one's about. In the southern part of the Pearl here, it's really about could we allow some buildings to be taller than the current maximum of 175 feet, specifically in exchange for preserving a small character-giving building somewhere in the district. So many of these would be linked directly to some public benefit in exchange. So that's what that one is about. The Morrison Bridgehead and Hawthorne Bridgehead ideas are really trying to respond to that notion of a vibrant, active 21st century urban waterfront that actually has more people on it on a regular basis, more eyes on it, and a little bit more of a direct interface between Waterfront Park and the city. So perhaps some taller buildings at those bridgeheads could actually help with that. So that's another one. We're also proposing to reduce height limits in a few areas. And these are within the 13th Avenue Historic District in the Pearl, where there's not a whole lot of development potential anyway. Most of that district is built with historic buildings. It has some height bonuses that are allowed today, and we would propose getting rid of those. And then in the sort of Red Crescent, if you remember the terminology of the 88 plan, the Red Crescent was going to be high-density development following the light rail line, the original light rail line from downtown over to Lloyd District. We're just going to do big office towers kind of following it, essentially. I'm oversimplifying, but I mean, that was kind of the idea. And so you had height limits of 460, 425 feet, all the way up through Old Town Chinatown to the steel bridgehead following that light rail line. Or well, actually the light rail line's down here, but following the transit mall and then kind of jumping to the bridge. And so we're proposing to reduce those, not extremely, but down to 325 and 250 from the sort of 400s that I was talking about, to reflect, you know, maybe a different future for Old Town Chinatown that isn't necessarily part of the office core. Still high density, mixed use, other things, but not part of the office core. So that's kind of the framework. So you'll notice that we're not really proposing any changes, although we've been asked to, and you'll hear that we should. From some folks in Goose Hollow, in the West End, in South Waterfront, most of South Downtown, or the north part of the Pearl, other than the waterfront where we'd like to be able to have a little more flexibility for additional height, specifically in exchange for greenway improvements, because as the Greenway Trail comes through that, and the whole greenway improvement, the bank, all that stuff, there's a pretty interesting opportunity. We may need more height because it's a pretty slim strip of developable land there. So. In Old Town Chinatown, the thing you'll hear most about is this one little section of 3 blocks that currently has a height limit of 100 feet. And we've proposed that we should study some sort of transfer tool that would allow additional height or non-contributing sites in exchange for preservation of historic resources in that district. That's pretty interesting, and it's all about trying to encourage investment in a district that hasn't seen nearly enough of it. It's also very controversial, and there's a lot of concerns about it, and they're very real concerns from members of the community. So people are kind of split on this, and we ended up with this study because we're not sure what's going to happen there. They didn't want to take it out of the plan completely, so it's still in as kind of a work item. And those of you who were around when we were doing the Skidmore Old Town, I'm looking at Michelle, design guidelines work and the code amendments there too. This is a little sort of shades of that idea, and it's that kind of argument about, do we want to use height as a flexibility tool to encourage more investment? What do we have to do to make that work? Is it? And I'm looking at Don too, and Don, yeah. So it's kind of one of those, and I'm not sure where it'll end up. We did some modeling of it. This is really the block. The full block is sort of the main opportunity site in there. This is Jack's Chinatown Parking, or the Goldsmith block. This is between 4th and 5th and Cooch and Davis in Old Town. It's a big empty lot. So here's kind of what you could do today with the existing 100-foot height limit. You'd pretty much have to build the whole thing out to the sidewalk and up to about 100 feet all around to get the FAR utilization there. But if you were able to, consider some design requirements and a little bit more height, then you could start to move the mass around a little bit and create some lower parts, maybe some plaza parts, various different things like that. If you're able to go higher, you can do even more of that. So that's the notion. People are interested in that. They're worried about that. We don't know exactly where that's going to end up. And we did a fair amount of outreach with this community. We had a lunch, invited a bunch of folks to kind of talk about it. At the end of the day, there's no single opinion here for sure, but we did some ground floor kind of modeling of how that might look. This is a 75-foot building kind of looking down 4th Avenue with the taller building in the back. Maybe that's acceptable, maybe not. We're not sure. And it's actually not the only thing about Old Town. There's also action items in the plan that you'll find that are about updating the National Register nomination for the historic district, which hasn't been updated since it was done, which could be pretty interesting and help clarify what's really important, what are the most important resources in the district, and what are the boundaries. Those kinds of issues could be talked about. There's a few other things on my list that I can't remember right now also, but there's more than just the height. It just tends to be that the conversation comes down to the height. We also worked pretty closely with the Portland Development Commission on the recently adopted by Council Old Town Chinatown 5-year action plan. Okay, so surface parking,
so
this one, yep.
Before we leave heights, question. So
we'll come back. There's another on heights for West End at the end, but
okay. My neighborhood newspapers made this kind of a cause celeb, so I've been hearing a little bit about it. It seems to me there are 3 claims that I've heard, or objections, however you want to phrase them. One is just the aesthetics of what kind of skyline do you want Portland to have, and obviously different people will have different opinions about that. The other 2 are more interesting to me because they're, I think they're potentially more data-based or research-based. One is that above a certain level of building height, you get more social isolation. And the other is that there's sort of a sweet spot for height for where you maximize the sustainability of a building, and then you go higher and it gets less efficient and it's less sustainable. Do we have, as a bureau or the stakeholder committee, have a view on either of those 2 points, social isolation and sustainability?
The other is just the way in is shade and wind tunnel effect. Those are 2 other significant ones that I hear about a lot.
So I'm not sure we really have time to go into the full height conversation right now at this briefing. I mean, maybe we do need to kind of come back with some of that, and we can make notes of that. I mean, we have talked about those issues, and I think generally come to the opinion that we're not completely convinced about the social isolation studies that we've seen. Most of them tended to be, that we've seen referenced, tended to be about social housing in places where there's sort of a lot of sort of social housing in towers, kind of, which is not the Portland context whatsoever. Our affordable sort of socialized housing is not.
Yeah.
I
think this is a much richer conversation. If I may, this is a much richer conversation to have, because I have a lot of concern about this as well. And I didn't think it would come up in the hearing, but more in the hearing from testimony about differences of opinion. So I think this is a very important thing to set aside and talk about.
So on this subject, is there information that you can get to us around, at least inform us of the different sides of this conversation? And along with that, we did discuss the Skidmore at a time and made a decision on that. So is it possible we could get that for some of the members that didn't have the I guess, the privilege of being here at the time and hearing that whole discussion and what we decided? Because many of these issues are identical, and the conversations are identical to that conversation 5 years ago, I guess it was, that we had at the time around Skidmore and height and at the water and specifically in Chinatown. So
Yeah,
if
I mean,
we
I
could
think-
get that out to everybody, a link to those documents, that'd be great. Thank you.
I think this is really, I mean, if we can get identified the kinds of things that would be helpful, we can provide them to you before the hearing.
Okay.
So
Mike?
Yeah, and this is, I can't remember when this came up before, but there are some really interesting visualization tools out there. And I don't know if they've come down in cost over the last couple decades. I know San Francisco did a lot of,
Probably.
I mean, going back and forth between what exists and what could be in the different colors is one thing, but there are really some pretty sophisticated tools that allow you to get a better feel for what the visual impacts would be, what it would actually look like. Which if we can get that as part of the conversation, down the road would be helpful, I think.
And are these online in color?
Yes.
Because that would help a lot.
Which-
Hard to look at.
Yes, yeah, the whole thing is online in color,
Yeah,
yes.
I'm not asking you to reproduce it in color, but to be able to look at it.
They're not-
Just just a teeny response, I think, maybe to you, Mike. Just so the risk of wanting, and we ran into this with our committee and many folks who were very interested in this issue, the risk of wanting to get to sort of a design proposal on height and sort of what it means is that, we're not going to build the buildings. We don't build the buildings. We're trying to create this flexible box that has the right kind of tools within it to make sure that the result is going to be good. It's not trying to make sure the result's going to be one thing. It's trying to be very flexible and let a whole lot of different things happen, and we have no idea what will actually be proposed on any one site. Right. So we just have to be very careful of the difference of this long-range plan and the role of design review and all these other things. So. Okay. Oh, gosh. So surface parking is something you may hear about a little bit. This is, there are a lot of surface parking lots in Old Town. This is, again, was something we talked about quite a bit when we worked on Skidmore a number of years ago. There is desire to see those surface lots redeveloped. There are many buildings in the historic districts that have no parking. They rely on those. So there's a series of different actions proposed and further items for study proposed in the plan that would help figure out how to replace that parking in garages and free up those sites for redevelopment. There were 2 items suggested by Rick Michelson, John Russell, Peggy Moretti, and a group of other smart folks who are very interested in seeing change in the district that were a little bit more stick kind of approaches. And one was the idea of taxing revenue on surface parking lot operational income, and one was the idea of just phasing out the legal land use of those surface lots as a legal kind of use, something you could do over time, amortization, it's also called. Those were pretty soundly rejected by our stakeholder advisory committee. Pretty much everybody but John, who was on the committee and likes the idea. And other groups like PBA and another group of folks working in Old Town have also kind of rejected them. I don't think they're gone, and you may very well hear about them. Okay, Morrison Bridgehead. So this is about this Bridgehead Heights idea. This one's controversial. This is while not, I wouldn't say it's a wholesale dismissal of the sort of age-old step down to the river policy. It is certainly a new interpretation of it in one particular area. And so the Morrison Bridgehead is right here. Morrison comes in, and there's these surface parking lots. This is where the public market is proposed today. But you can see the problem here too is that we have about 6 blocks here that are all are all redevelopment sites, and they haven't developed for years and years and years, and they're facing our signature open space waterfront park. So there's a problem here, right? So as one way to try and encourage more development, more investment, more people down by the park and river, we were asked to look at what if we increase building height limits around that bridgehead. Not in the historic district, so this is a historic district, Skidmore, and this is a historic district over here, this is Yam Hill. But in between, on all those big surface parking lots around the bridgehead, what if we let that be big and urban and different? And so this is kind of the proposal. We ended up to 250 feet with probably some design step backs and requirements and other things in that first block and up to perhaps 325 feet behind. So that's the proposal that's in there now. This wasn't unanimous either, but this is what the committee ended up supporting and kind of moving on. Environmental stewardship generally. So you've got a minority report in your packet from Bob Salinger and Jeannie Galick, 2 of our stakeholder advisory committee members who are respectfully saying that we kind of missed the boat on environmental objectives and targets and opportunities in this planning effort. So I guess my response to that would be, there is a lot of stuff in here about environmental issues, and particularly in Chapter 4, that Central City-wide section. There's information about, or at least direction to work on climate change adaptation, habitat, water quality, green infrastructure, bird-friendly guidelines and development, flooding, heat island wildlife. All these things are identified. They're not going to the level of specificity, I think, that Bob and Jeannie and others would like. And frankly, we would also like to be there, but we're not there yet. And the nature of this as a sort of an interim step towards a new Central City plan and being adopted by resolution and giving us the guidance to go work on all this stuff, zoning and environmental issues in more detail over the next year, is kind of part of the problem, and I think the source of some of that criticism. So in a way, we sort of agree with the criticism. In a way, we think there actually is a fair amount of stuff in there, and it's not entirely fair to say that there's nothing in there. And then the one other thing I'd like to point out here is that in Appendix A, we actually added a fairly new detailed list since the version the last Stakeholder Advisory Committee version that minority report was written based on sort of on context and kind of what we need to do regarding the Greenway plan. So the river stuff, there's more information in there, and that's on page 143. So you can look at that in context with that minority report and see if that helps. And then finally on West End. So West End is probably the place you'll hear the most, this is kind of the source of probably the most opposition to continuing allowing tall residential development. So the existing height map is there, and I just kind of reiterate, we're really not proposing to change existing policy. You can see kind of a picture here. The West End is a very interesting and diverse mix architecturally of some tall new buildings and some older, shorter, older buildings. There are a lot of redevelopment opportunities. As we looked at the targets of sort of jobs and households that we think would be added to the West End over the plan horizon of 20 years, and tried to put it in the context of, well, how much development and how many buildings would that be? That's kind of what generates this map. So, there is certainly some significant development. It's not everywhere. And some of it is likely to be tall, and some of it is likely to not be tall because of the nature of the market and kind of how that works. This was something we did talk about at some length with our committee. We've heard about it in public comment at our committee meetings, pretty much at every meeting for the last 8 months, over and over again. And so there's some serious passion behind this group of stakeholders, and it's great, and I applaud it. The committee and staff, for the most part, was not very interested in the idea of looking at an 8-story West End, particularly given that we think the existing policy is actually serving us pretty well, and that the several new taller buildings have actually added a lot of life and energy and people to the district, and it's actually kind of working out. That said, we agree with some ancillary arguments as part of this line that there are some real risks in terms of preservation as the district continues to develop, and there are a lot of unprotected potential historic resources in the district, and there are some, there's probably some improvements we could do to our sort of design regulations around it, making sure that we have a very livable, vibrant kind of ground plane in these larger buildings. So we do actually have nothing about lowering the height limits in the West End, but we do have a series of actions around historic preservation, looking at updating the inventory, improved transfer provisions, trying to link taller buildings perhaps to, or the ability to do taller buildings to perhaps to preserving some smaller, older character-giving buildings that could otherwise be at risk. And that's a notion that we want to pursue in the Pearl District as well. And then we also want to add perhaps some more flexibility for more commercial uses in some areas of the district where it's pretty much residential only. So a building like the YWCA, if you're familiar with it, was in that picture, for example, has a hard time finding a new use now because it's really only allowed to be residential. So a little more flexibility could be a preservation tool for a building like that. And then we also have committed to, and I think it would be a really good idea, to take a close look at some zoning, both development standards and design guideline tools around step backs, setbacks. Those are different kind of massing tools to create varied urban forms, inviting public realm, and make sure that new development, if it's big, is doing a good job in terms of design. This is the Hasselo on 8 project, the Superbrock project in the Lloyd district. as an example of ways to kind of get some pretty interesting amenities out of allowing some taller buildings. So that's kind of where we ended up on that. Definitely didn't make everybody happy on that one, but tried. And then on the West Quadrant Plan next steps, we've got your hearing on September 9th. We're looking forward to it. I'm sure you are as well. City Council hearing sometime after that, probably in October, depending on how long you want to spend with it. And then over the next year, we've got a lot of work to do to integrate all these 3 quadrant plans and the concept plan and get into a whole bunch of zoning code work. So this is the slide I was alluding to earlier, where you've got down there at the bottom left all the 3 quadrant plans and the concept plan, which are all coming. Southeast coming to you early next year or late this year, probably. All of that is resolution only, guidance to the final plan, so we can take the policies and things out of that, but we still need to assemble this final Central City 2035 plan. That is the new Central City plan that will replace the old Central City plan. But that also needs to have a zoning code ordinance, and all that needs to be informed by all these other things we have to do over the next year as well. Not week, year. So we're doing a height bonus transfer study to figure out how to get the most out of our FAR and height bonus and transfer tools. The current system is a little bit of a hodgepodge. Could certainly be much more effective. We're doing a scenic resources inventory, and we'll be doing an environmental, social, economic analysis on that as well, trying to figure out our view corridors and protected public views. There's all the zoning code work, including all the parking policies and minimums and all of that stuff as well. And then there's a whole sub kind of task around the Willamette Greenway code work. So all of that needs to come together in this great vortex over the next year and produce for you a new Central City plan.
No sweat. No sweat.
Yeah.
Well done. Good job. Questions? We'll just go around this way.
Oh, well, let me start by saying, personally, I never thought I could sit in a deck chair in Times Square, but that's possible today. So your concept of a Times Square in Portland resonated. I wonder, though, in 2 cases, we have kind of icons already existing that are centers. One is Powell's Bookstore, which is sort of the center of the universe. And the other is the fact that soccer seems to be taking on with that stadium. Those are both issues around what I consider to be Times Square options. And I think maybe Broadway and Burnside is a swell idea, but as you point out, it's not exactly the most commanding place in the world. And there are 2 others that I can think of right now that I'd love to lie in the middle of the street and look at the sun. So for consideration, I think you should think about that. The other comment I want to make is really a personal one. I have good friends who have serious interest and investment in Chinatown, Old Town. And they think the city's been dragging their feet for a long time in that area. And what I hear and see here is a lot of general good idea, but nothing specific about this kind of center of the city that has a lot of ethnic quality as well to it. So I'm a voice for some folks down there that have said for a long time and been campaigning to have Old Town Chinatown be a little more attention paid to. Thanks.
Mike?
Carl, you intimated that I might have some questions. I just got this thing, so I believe it or not, I actually read things before I ask questions. So I'm sure I will have some questions. The overriding one that from the feedback I've gotten from some folks who are concerned about the environmental issues is that there was, from one draft to the last draft, there were pretty massive changes. And so from my perspective, it would be helpful if there's some way to track exactly what those changes were so that I could use my own judgment to see how significant they were. I think it'd be helpful for everybody, actually. That's it.
We'll go with the honored citizen today, Don.
Yeah, the prodigal commissioner.
Prodigal.
Sorry. Carl, thanks for the presentation. This really looks great. Basic question, I was racking my brain the other evening, which is becoming more fragile. We've done 4 quadrants, and those kind of cumulatively form our city center plan, right? Or new central city plan. Is the central city, has it become larger than the old central city?
Not
With
yet.
this new planning effort, or are we pretty much kind of within the confines of the old central.
Well, so
city.
the 88 Central City Plan had a smaller boundary. It was expanded through several processes over the years.
Yeah, I'm aware of that.
So it was expanded in 96 with the Goose Hollow Stationary Community Plan, and a few other times went out Burnside. So there were some expansions. Right now, at this point, we're not proposing to expand the Central City Plan District boundary.
Okay, great, thanks.
It could happen through the southeast quadrant.
We'll see how it goes, yeah.
Michelle?
So I obviously haven't read this yet, but I know the issue of activating the waterfront has been a huge issue for a long time. And I know that Portlanders aren't waiting for us to activate the waterfront, they're touching the water. Is that it?
Oh.
This is a different style, so. Okay, so people are touching the water a lot more now. And we're starting to see some conflicts. I know in the last month there have been a fair amount of conflicts, for example, between swimmers and human-powered crafts. So I would just sort of point that out there, that there's some sort of test areas you could look at right now to see where the difficulties are coming up and consider how that can possibly be addressed in some of the policies.
Mike?
Yeah, along those lines, I'll bring up the same question or observation I've made at every step of the way, and that is Ross Island never makes its way into these plans. And when we're talking about animating the river and bringing more people to the river, I spent several hours over the last couple weeks communicating back and forth with folks who live in South Waterfront, particularly in the Meriwether, the Port of Portland, the State Marine Board and others, City of Portland, Portland Parks, dealing with the incredible incursions that are being made by people onto Ross Island. And there are very significant concerns. You mentioned at the outset you wanted to respect those natural resources as well as animate the river and bring more people to the river. That is a huge issue we're going to have to wrestle with. And we keep, Ross Island never quite makes it into the picture, but at some point we're going to have to be very, very explicit about what we're going to tolerate with regard to impacts on those natural resources. I'm all for getting people into the river and using the river, but in a respectful way, and there are some very significant issues that we're going to deal with.
I would just say it's on both sides. It's not just Ross Island. If you paddle down the channel, you see more and more homeless encampments along the bank.
Yeah.
Other questions?
One other, just one quick one. I want to add a second voice to Howard's point on Chinatown. It's incredible, as I look at it, it's an incredible reservoir of land and of sites that are underutilized and also sites that are developed with great character. And I see it as a real potential in Portland, and I hope something can happen sooner than later. And I've seen some momentum being built lately, which I'm encouraged by. It's also transit rich. It has great infrastructure. And so the more we can do there, the better, I think.
Howard?
Thanks, Don. I wanted to add something else. The word tourism, as we develop the city and the Central City Plan, we're seeing more and more tourism. The Times Square notion sure speaks to that. And where I go with that is the word walking streets. They're a wonderful thing to have in any case, people that walk absolutely without traffic constriction. Europe has made it work for years. The Ramblas in Barcelona is a good example. So as we develop these Times Square notions around maybe the word walking streets, we're encouraging a lot of tourism in those areas as well. So I know we're dealing with height limitations and zoning, but we're also dealing with the city growing and expanding, and I think that needs to be in consideration.
Other questions? First, I'd say great job. Having 16 meetings, 33 people on a committee, amazing. I mean, it's just a great job, and I think you've done a good job of laying out some great ideas and movement forward. So thank you for your efforts, and thanks, Susan.
Yeah. Always entertaining.
How do you say that much in that amount of time?
With interruptions.
It's a gift, Carl.
It is. He's-
talking the speed you and I can't follow. It works. I mean, we're old people, we don't know how this works.
I do think we're going to have an opportunity, after you listen to all the testimony on September 9th, that may result in us having a lot more questions, a lot of comments, potentially able to make a decision on that date, but also potentially that you're going to have really disparate opinions on particular issues among the commission. And so we want to keep this on schedule as much as we can. So I want to think about and have you talk a little bit about how do we get there in a way that between now and September 9th, you can raise issues that you know are going to be key issues for you. And that because I've talked to somebody else, I know they have either the similar opinion or maybe they have an exact opposite opinion. And I'd want to be able to begin to start having those conversations offline, because if you do them here, it's rushed, and you don't have the opportunity to really be able to understand each other better. So let's talk about how you want to do that. You've got, you know, it's 3 or 4 weeks. It's not a lot of time. So it's more of a commitment to, you know, diving in early and getting comments to us early, I think.
I think that's the first thing is, first, let's all take some bed reading and kind of read this and get our comments to folks. I have a number of questions, but I haven't read it, so, you know, kind of wait. But I think if we can get our comments to you, and also if we could then kind of aggregate maybe the comments so that we have those common interest areas, you know where the public's going to come from. And so maybe we can start getting, maybe not answers, but what the thinking was around the policies. I'm also concerned that we've made a decision on part of this 5 years ago, Michelle brought up. And so how do we, you know, that's pretty recent in, I guess, history, and some of us were here at the time. So our thinking about how did we think about height? How did we think about the waterfront and some of these things at that time? Because I remember Ross Island was brought up at that time too, at the same time. So a lot of these, not a lot, but some of these things have been thought about before. And you know, to me, why would my decision change or my thinking process if I can remember what I was thinking 5 years ago at that time when we made the decision? So if you can refresh our memory on that, may.
Right, and just to clarify on that point, the Skidmore had the design guidelines piece, which kind of went through Landmarks Commission, and it had some code changes piece, including this transfer tools, and many of those transfer tools ideas and things are kind of included or in the work program for next year to develop. The idea of those 5 or whatever they were height opportunity sites at the edge of the Skidmore district, those are not in there. They're not in there anymore. So they were recommended by the committee. They have kind of went to council. They kind of died there. We're kind of doing the whole thing now, and they're no longer there. You know, I think we just felt that they just weren't supportable, and we kind of went through this process without looking at other opportunities to mess with height, but not within that Skidmore district.
But there was some thought process about the building massing and why there was, we wanted to go that way or why we didn't want to go that way. And I think that's important to, I guess just history-wise, you know, the old adage, look at history and it informs the future, so.
I have a question for Susan. Going back to your comment about the possibility of making a decision on the 9th, so there won't be a work session per se on this?
At this point.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, at this point, we were just planning to have the hearing and then have a discussion after the hearing, sort of the work session as a part of it, and then if you can, move to a vote at that time. And if you can't, and the only reason is you have, you know, all of these different issues are coming at you right now.
Right.
But I don't want to rush. I want to have a good decision. But I just also don't want us, I want you all to understand that we spent a lot of time when we were doing the Portland plan, thinking big picture. Now we're in the details, and it kind of takes, you know, a pep talk I need to give you all to, you know, you need to jump in and kind of really look at the issues so that we're not saying, oh yeah, well, we'll just have another meeting on this, so I don't need to dump into it now. So
Okay.
if
Okay.
anyone needs a pep talk, call me and I'll provide you
Well,
one.
is the opportunity to, it sounds like, I mean, and you can take a look, but maybe beforehand, we can, in terms of the officer's briefing, look at whether or not the issues are significant enough to try to say, maybe we just pre-schedule the work session if there's a needed, if we think so, and then move after that to a decision point. Howard?
Question, Mr. Chair, actually. This is an incredibly important part of work in the comp plan going forward. And I'm concerned and interested that PDC, Transportation, TriMet are kind of all at the table here, playing and participating in this decision, that when we go to council, we're presenting an idea that's embraced by the Development Commission, the Transportation Department, Parks, and so forth. And we almost become a focal point for a very important part of the city, critical part of the city going forward. So I want our endorsement, our excitement around this to reflect PDC's excitement and the transportation's excitement. And I'm hoping they can be with us and chat and, interject if they feel they have to. And so that would be nice.
Clarification.
Yes.
So we're going to be talking about heights in Old Town, Chinatown, independent of design guidelines in Old Town, Chinatown, correct?
So right now, there's a recommendation to study the transfer tool, to look at the heights and be part of a transfer as part of the code work. The
But it's all
design
study.
guidelines
Okay.
are in there as a separate action item. They are imagined to be after adoption
Okay.
of the new plan, because we don't feel like we can do them at the same time. And that's been an issue that's been raised by a few people.
Okay.
So just a clarification on the heights, we would just be setting the limit and then the,
Right, and just remember, so it's resolution, right? So,
Yes.
and these height maps are a little conceptual, right? We've got some caveats in there saying we don't know exactly how the bonus stuff's gonna work. We don't know about exactly what we need to do near open spaces. We don't know where the views are exactly. So all of that stuff gets revised. This is kind of the general direction. If we can get city council, you guys in city council to say, yeah, this is pretty good. This is, even if it's 90% or whatever, you can even flag some stuff that you want to make sure we work on or take a close look at over the next year. But you're not going to get that actual height map that would become part of the code until next year.
but this would give a general direction to that height
Right.
map.
Yeah,
Correct.
exactly.
Okay.
That's our starting place. I mean,
That's our target place.
start there.
And for the environmental issues and all the issues you've identified here, it's the general concept going forward that then the details will be ferreted out in the other work sessions, or not work sessions, but action items.
But that said, details are important. So
Yes.
get them in there early, I guess
Yeah.
is the point.
Yeah.
We don't want to wait and be here a year later, and you're finally getting to some details that you thought about, because I think, that'll harm the process in terms of
Okay.
getting it to council early. Would be great.
Okay. And in terms of, one last question, in terms of partners, Keena and Howard, so transportation, PDC, Multnomah County, the partners that need to be involved will be accessible? BES will be accessible at our hearing?
Yeah, we can
Or
try to
work
make that
session
happen.
or
Yeah, I mean,
at
and they've
some
been
point.
involved,
Been
we've
very
been working
Yeah.
with the technical advisory committee, that all of those folks you just mentioned and
Okay.
many others are represented.
Okay.
They've been tracking the process.
Okay.
We had some folks on our committee, Ben Duncan from the county was on the committee.
Okay.
So they have been engaged, but we'll do what we can to get them actually at the hearing. And
Okay.
PBOT's been, really part of the team
Yeah.
all along, so.
But I think, to Howard's point, it would be good to
Yep.
have all the public agencies here that are key partners because of the questions. Other questions, concerns? So read and get your questions into them within, I would say, the next, 2 weeks, week and a half, Susan? At the latest?
I think 2 weeks would be great, and if you can send them
Yeah.
to Carl and Julie,
Okay,
both,
Carl and Julie,
I think that good.
okay?
Yeah.
And let's make sure we've got Carl, everyone's got Julie's address, but let's make sure we've got Carl's address, if we could get that out. Be Perfect. Thank you very much, Carl. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
Next, we have mixed-use zone projects. Barry?
We're going to need about 3 minutes to just do a technology change, but I also want to just acknowledge that we're starting a little bit late, and this is about a 45-minute agenda item, and your schedule says you're adjourning in 15, so I just want to flag that we're still going to have most of you here or not.
Does anybody need to leave? We have almost a quorum. I mean, we've got almost a full house, so we've got,
We will be done by 4.
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we've got 10, so.
Yeah, yeah, Howard, there was a fire by your house, you knew about that.
No, you're right.
Yeah, there's not any spare openings here, so you can unplug the mouse for a second and do that, and then plug it back in.
No, I don't think so. I think it's more
Thing on here.
just feeling like
We're going to get started.
Howard, Don? Dog bites get infected, dog and cat bites both, cat more than dog. They get infected pretty easily. A lot of people will put you on antibiotics to prevent further dog bite regardless of the situation. So it's getting worse.
Yeah, it wasn't numb. Until just I started sitting down on it, and I was just like, okay, what's that all about?
It's gonna work?
Like, you know,
Oh, I thought you were gonna do the video. It might be that.
It's gonna work.
You need to put some,
We're going to get started.
Yeah, I would, you know, what I'd be.
shut up, listen. Can you talk as fast as possible?
So I guess we're ready to go. Again, my name is Eric Engstrom, Principal Planner with BPS. With me is Barry Manning, and we're going to tag team this a little bit. We have kind of three parts to this. First part is we want to just tee off this conversation by reviewing the video that is on our website about centers and corridors. It gives some context about why we're doing this. Second piece is I will give a little more context about how this mixed-use zoning project fits into the larger set of projects that we have which relate, including the comp plan map and the urban design framework and potential refinement projects later. And then I'll turn it over to Barry to do more about what the project is about and what it's trying to accomplish and what we've learned so far. So here we go with the video, and we did manage to figure out how to make this work. So
Eric? Eric, can you get a little closer to the mic? Or get the mic closer to you?
It's a little faint.
You gotta dance.
What makes cities such vibrant places? Cities attract people to jobs, higher education, medical services, arts, and culture. Cities give us options for how we get around and where we live. Cities provide public spaces to gather and connect with a diverse range of people. In short, cities are places where people create communities. Portland is a great American city. And like many cities, Portland is growing. It will continue to grow. Portland's population is also becoming more diverse. Today, more than 40% of all K-12 students are from communities of color. People from all over the world come to live here. Like you, many people are attracted to Portland's natural beauty, recreation, unique neighborhoods, job opportunities, food culture, and a strong sense of community.
Like a lot of people, I moved to Portland because of the quality of this place. I'd heard about it, I checked it out, and I moved here because I wanted to live in a real city that had real farmland and nature not far away, and had neighborhoods of distinct character.
Portland is made up of almost 100 unique neighborhoods. Many of them are healthy and connected, meaning they support the health and well-being of people of all ages and abilities. These neighborhoods offer safe and convenient access to the goods and services needed in daily life, like grocery stores, schools, libraries, restaurants, and parks, places that are reachable on foot or by bike. These neighborhoods are also well connected to jobs and the rest of the city by public transportation, and they offer a variety of housing choices for households of all sizes, ages, and incomes. Today, only about half of all Portlanders live in healthy, connected neighborhoods.
We're both planning and measuring. We know where the deficiencies are. We know the neighborhoods that don't have a complete sidewalk network. We know the parts of the city where there's not enough employment. So we can focus our work, whether it's neighborhood economic development or construction of public works.
How we plan for the future of our city can help make more neighborhoods even better. In the next 15 years, Portland's households will change. More than half of all Portlanders will live by themselves, and more people will live longer. As our city changes, we'll need housing and communities that meet the needs of our changing population in all parts of the city. Right now, about 65% of all new construction in Portland is multifamily housing. That number will likely reach 80% by 2035. Housing for different ages and household types can help our city flourish, attracting new businesses, employers, and services. More people can provide more tax dollars for parks, schools, roads, and clean water. Portland is growing, and if we plan it right, this growth and change will help Portland become a more prosperous, equitable, healthy, and resilient city.
That's a good video.
So this was all in-house, and our graphic artist took a bunch of, basically how to make videos, and she got into it. And I mean, my dad spent 30 years as a filmmaker, and so he saw this, of course, had little critiques, but was like, you did this? Like, how fast did she learn this? And he's feeling very old because of it. And a lot of this was taken literally on people's phones by interns. So we're excited about it.
It's really good.
Good stuff.
Great.
Okay, and we successfully transitioned back to PowerPoint, I think.
Yeah.
So we'll proceed with the briefing. And I can move the mic back to me. So as I said, we're going to give a little bit of framework and context for where this project fits within the other activity of the Bureau, talk about what we're doing, give you an understanding of what we've done in terms of outreach and assessment and research so far, and then go over some preliminary issue lists that we have. And Barry will talk more about that when we get there. First, project context. This slide just shows a sequence of different projects that relate to one another. On the left, early on with the Portland plan, we included a version of the urban design framework diagram and the centers and corridors diagram, which has evolved, and another version is in the proposed draft of the comp plan that we've released. This is an illustrative diagram that communicates our intent about where we're growing, and it tries to give sharper focus to where we grow by identifying town centers, civic corridors, and neighborhood centers and corridors, and saying in the policy document what that means. The comp plan maps that you'll be reviewing, that Deborah started talking about earlier, takes this a step further and brings that down to the parcel level and says, how does that affect the actual land use designations that are in our comprehensive plan and eventually in our zoning. And again, as Deborah mentioned later, that will find form in zoning map changes in 2015. But for now, what you're looking at in the comp plan map is a translation of that urban design framework and that typology of places into the land use map, particularly as it affects commercial and mixed use areas outside of the central city. Barry's project, which he will talk a little bit more about, is more in the code end. So there's what it's doing is looking at the toolbox of zones that we have in place in these kind of places and recalibrating and coming up with a new palette of those zones that can be applied when we release the zoning map changes when we get to that stage in the comp plan. So it's a little bit of it's a necessary tool to implement the new comp plan map, but I want to emphasize this project is not doing the mapping, though the overall comp plan is doing the mapping as to where the town centers and corridors are. This project is working on what the different types of zoning regulations that might apply once we've identified those places. And I know you can't do one without the other, you need to understand both, so we're kind of operating in parallel with those distinct missions. The last bit of the slide is just to acknowledge that there's a lot of refinement plans that will come later after we adopt the comp plan. Some of them will be specific action plans or land use refinement for priority areas. For example, the Hollywood plan or the interstate plan are examples from our recent past or the St. John's plan of those kind of more fine-grained looks at a particular area. We also have additional code and process improvement ahead of us that will be beyond the adoption of the new comp plan. So all that kind of relates together into a sequence of events that affects what kind of development we see on our mixed-use corridors and areas outside of the central city. Again, this is the urban design framework, and as I mentioned, it's intended to provide a sharper focus and communicate where we ought to grow. I think was said earlier, the 2040 plan doesn't contemplate just ubiquitous growth inside the urban growth boundary. It contemplates planned growth in the urban growth boundary, and there's places to grow and places not to grow. And we are trying to work those details out with this document and with the comp plan map. It's access to transit is one ingredient, but there's a lot of other ingredients that we've talked about in the concept of the complete neighborhoods, or Howard referred to the 20-minute neighborhood term, which is a similar concept. So these are intended to implement that Portland Plan vision as well, and establish a common language and set of ingredients that go into creating distinctive and high-performing places, and establish a common language for the kind of scale of those different places. That translates onto the comp plan map with the map you see in front of you, which is one of the layers, the centers and corridors layer is one of the layers on the map app. This gives weight to the urban design framework and is one step in the direction of moving it down to the actual zoning map. It's the first step necessary to make that move. And it provides us a basis for doing that zoning work later. It translates the place types from the urban design framework into specific mixed-use designations, and there's 4 proposed: urban center, civic corridor, mixed-use neighborhood, and dispersed. And those loosely correspond to the types of places on the urban design framework. The urban center designation, which is the darkest color, which you can see if you look at the map closely, in places like Lentz or St. John's or in the corridors around the central city. We've applied that designation to all the town centers as well as any of the neighborhood centers and corridors that are close in within that first mile or two from the downtown. And that's an acknowledgement that there are different types of centers and corridors, and that the context is a little different when you're in an inner neighborhood versus a further out location. Just the economy of development and the scale of things, the expected scale of things is slightly different. So there is that element of the proposal that I wanted to flag of using this urban center designation for both those purposes. These are, we did not remap these areas. These are the existing commercial and mixed use areas of the map. But yes, they follow yes, they follow this map, but also, many of our commercial mixed use zones are on our major transit corridors like Sandy or Barber or Foster, MLK and Interstate, 82nd Avenue, 122nd, so those kind of places. I mentioned earlier possible refinement work. This is stuff that we'd be working on post 2016 after you've digested the comp plan and amended the maps. It might include more fine-grained look at mass and height in specific areas, such as 82nd Avenue is a specific sort of known issue of needing a closer look when we get a little further. We will be looking at how well the design review system works, looking at potentially the community design standards, and then this question of where are design overlays. All of that is out there on kind of a list of potential refinement work that relates to this project but is not within the core of our scope right now. And I'm going to transition at this point to Barry and have him go over the sort of what this project is about and some of its key goals and findings.
So again, I'm Barry Manning. I'm a planner and the project manager for the mixed-use zones projects. Thanks for sticking around late today. Before we get going, I wanted to also mention that it's not just a project, a solo project. I'm working with several other staff in our bureau: Bill Cunningham, Shannon Bono, Laura Lillard, Tyler Bump, and Samantha Petty, who's an intern with us, are all working on this project. And so we're part of a team that's trying to pull this together. And we're in the early phases of this now, but I want to acknowledge them before we go any further. So I want to give you a quick overview of what we're doing. Eric touched on many of these things. Again, this is the Mixed Use Zones project is an implementation project of the comp plan, which you're going to be seeing shortly in terms of public hearings. As you'll hear, the majority of Portland's future growth is directed at these centers and corridors throughout town, and the zoning needs to accommodate not only housing but employment growth in these places. So our goal here is to really make that work. Currently, most of these places have commercial and the central employment zone applied to them, so all of the C zones from neighborhood commercial to general commercial to commercial storefront. Those currently allow a very broad range of activities from commercial to residential to some employment. We want to fine tune those to make them a better fit to better implement the comprehensive plan as we're moving forward and to respond to some other concerns and opportunities that we've heard from neighborhoods, development interest, and several other folks in the community. So ultimately, we're going to create this refined palette of zones that we can apply throughout Portland in these areas and hopefully address those objectives. The project really has its roots again in two of the key directions of the comp plan, the notion of creating complete neighborhoods by growing in centers and corridors. So Eric's already mentioned that we have town centers and civic corridors identified in the map, as well as neighborhood centers and corridors. We're really focused on those areas. And the other idea or a big direction that we were responding to as a goal with this project is to respond to the direction of encouraging job growth and making sure that we have successful neighborhood business districts is a big piece of that job growth as well. We've talked about central city and industrial areas and institutions, but this is another important aspect. So our project needs to think about all these different things. So key goals here, in addition to creating these zones to implement the comp plan, some of our initial working or kind of marching orders are thinking about issues such as building scale and transitions and retail spaces in these centers and corridors. How do we make them successful places? Looking at addressing design and context and integration with local character better. Making sure that we allow feasible mixed-use development, not only now but in the future. So how do we transition, making sure that these are market acceptable kind of zoning solutions. We want to make sure that we're planning for housing that's affordable to a range of Portland incomes, allowing for those commercial and employment uses I mentioned earlier, and then thinking back to the Portland plan, making sure that we're considering the equity implications of whatever we do in terms of how different zoning outcomes are going to affect different people, different neighborhoods, being aware of those trade-offs. Things that we're not addressing in the mixed-use zones project, my favorite slide, no. We are not addressing parking head-on in this project. There is a corollary parking management study going on for centers and corridors. It's the project manager is Piedmont, and Grant Moorhead is managing that project. They're currently recruiting for an advisory committee, and they're going to be getting underway very shortly. And we're going to be working with them pretty closely to understand what lessons we can learn from their work and apply it here. So we have a relationship with them. You just heard a great presentation from Carl in Central City. We're not touching anything in the Central City. This is all areas outside of the Central City. We're not doing the mapping, as Eric mentioned, and we're not looking at residential development or design standards in any of the single to multi-dwelling zones. This is really only looking at the commercial and the central employment type zones. Just a quick notion on the timeline or recap of the timeline. We've been underway for a little while. We actually came to you back in December and talked a little bit about the project startup. We got going around the end of last year, finalizing an IGA with Metro, who is our project sponsor. This project is funded by a CET, Construction Excise Tax Grant. We've convened a project advisory committee. We have a technical advisory committee, and we've hired a consultant team. That team is Diet and Bhatia out of San Francisco, augmented by a number of local subcontractors, DECA Architects, Jerry Johnson from Johnson Economics, as well as Bill Tripp, who's a local architect and urban designer as well. So we've got a well-rounded national and local team. We're in the research phase right now. I'm going to talk a lot about that in the rest of the presentation. We're actually getting ready to wrap that up with a report due to Metro at the end of September. We're getting into the concept development phase, which will run through the end of the year. And the idea there is that's where we actually try to build concepts for these different zones we're going to apply. We'll be testing that with the public in a couple of opportunities later on this fall. And then the third phase is the code development, where we actually try to put the concepts in a code format. We'll be testing that again back with different workshops and whatnot, but then coming back to you in the late spring or maybe early summer with a proposal for a code package that would implement this. So that's the general time frame that we're looking at. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about public outreach and what's in our assessment report right now. We've done quite a bit of public outreach so far in the project, and I'll recap some of that for you right now. As I mentioned, we have a project advisory committee. It's 27 members. It's got representatives from development interest, design and architecture interest, business interest, neighborhood and community interest. So we think we have a well-rounded group, and we think we're straddling all parts of the community from the west side to the central parts of the inner east side to outer East Portland. So we think we've got that pretty well covered. We've had about 5 meetings with them so far. We've done and attended several community meetings like neighborhood associations and business associations. We're also involved with the Division Design Initiative group. So if you hear of those, we're attending those meetings kind of on an as-needed ad hoc basis. We've conducted some community walks. I'm going to talk about those in detail. We recently conducted some roundtables with different groups of developers, designers, architects. So we'll touch on what we learned in those. Yes.
Just curious, do you include landscape architects when you're talking about design? They come to the table with a slightly different perspective in the architectural community.
We didn't include them specifically in this roundtable, but I think we'll have some more checking in to do as well. So we want to include that perspective as well. And then again, I mentioned open houses coming up later in the fall and winter. So the first set of outreach we took on was some neighborhood walks that were a subset of our case study locations that are part of our assessment report we're doing right now. The case study is really looking at a number of details about how development is happening in those 20-odd pink circles on the page, and the stars indicate the locations of the walks where we actually went out in the community and looked at things. We did these walks, 7 of them total, in late April through early June. Touched base with about 170 people on those walks. A very popular walk on Southeast Division Street with about 65 or so people attending that one, and heard a lot of comments and feedback from them. Yeah, if any of you were there, it was a very interesting and good walk, but there's been a lot of development on Division, and that's attracted a lot of attention. Williams was also an area that we've attracted a lot of interest in because of some of the community transition issues as well as some of the development issues there. So we had some common themes on these walks. And by the way, we had staff, leading these walks. We took notes and we listened to the folks, and we had a series of questions about development. So we went through many of the things you typically talk about on a walk, learning about the community and what people feel is working and what's not working. But some of the common themes we heard from the walks is that the project and the zoning ought to address building scale in terms of height, mass, and length better than it does now. So what can our new zones do to address that? One common theme we've heard from most of our walk areas was provide some kind of a scale transition to adjacent low-density residentially zoned areas. So if you're going to have single-family housing nearby, how do we transition to those areas effectively? Many of the walks had a common theme of encouraging continuity of retail, at least in the centers and corridors. So making sure that we have the opportunity to provide that flexible opportunity for commercial space or retail space as the area evolves. A common theme was protecting or preserving key places or buildings in those communities. Most places had some key structures or nodes of buildings where they felt they were significant and we ought to be protecting them. Multnomah Village downtown was a good example of one of those places where people felt strongly about the protection of that particular character. And we heard about incentivizing for open space and plazas that are open to the public. So those were well-regarded places when they occurred in the community, and folks said they would like to see more of them, and if we could figure out a way to make that happen through zoning, that would be ideal. Most folks wanted to improve the design of buildings by addressing materials. There was some discussion about whether the materials being used in some of the buildings today are as permanent or of as high quality as they'd like to see in the future. Most folks wanted to encourage a housing mix for a range of lifestyles. We heard that through all the walks. Promoting affordability of commercial space as well as housing was a frequently cited issue. Concern about new development and rent prices increasing and displacing commercial activity. Parking was an issue for many of the districts, making sure that we address parking issues. And then we did talk about opportunity sites in most of these areas. Most of them had large sites or sites that were not part of the normal fabric of the streets. And we discussed the possibility of maybe larger or more intense development on those sites, or potentially trading off for preservation on some of those sites. So those were some common themes. And at the end of this, I'm going to pass out a packet that not only has more detail on the walks, but also some information about the national research our consultants done, but I don't have a lot more detail for you in this presentation. So we just finished up some roundtable discussions with developers, affordable housing developers, designers, and architects, and neighborhood small businesses, talking to about 60 folks, and I'm going to go through some of those highlights right now. So in the developer conversation, they were very interested in certainty, flexibility, and code simplicity, making sure that we have a clear path for development. We had discussion about public goods such as affordability, open areas, plazas. They said that those were doable with meaningful incentives, including things like additional height or floor area, fee waivers, reduced permit times. A notion that code should be sensitive towards lot size. We have kind of a one-size-fits-all approach right now, and maybe we ought to be thinking about that differently. Talked a little bit about ground floor commercial. That was something that we heard from the neighborhoods as being a desired feature. There's concern about that notion that planning for active use might be a better way to do that. We can't force retail where it might not be appropriate or the market might not be there yet. We heard comments about the design system not working as well as it could right now, and it might need to be looked at to be more predictable, particularly if we're going to expand that. And we also heard notions about different city requirements, bureau requirements, other goals, sometimes conflicting with zoning objectives. So maybe taking a look at how we can reconcile those. From the architects and designers, many similar themes, so I won't go over all of these things. I guess one of the key things that jumped out here differently than the developer conversation was that we talked a little bit more about height limits and FARs in this, and there was some discussion about allowing more flexibility with height limits amongst this group to get a varied pattern, and that could be worked with FAR to help sculpt buildings to a greater degree. We talked about how the buildings interface with the ground floor and whether we ought to be requiring zero setbacks or whether we ought to have more flexibility there with some kind of a setback budget that would allow for those indentations and articulations for people gathering or outdoor dining areas and things of that nature. And again, they reflected that the design system is probably something that needs to be looked at more closely to see if there's a way to provide a little bit more certainty and streamlining that process a bit. Affordable housing developers, again, wanted certainty, flexibility, and code simplicity, very similar to the other folks. They felt that for affordable housing, the program was determined more by funding sources than by incentives. It doesn't respond to incentives and bonuses the same way that it might for the for-profit or private side. So they did acknowledge that they felt that those types of incentives and bonuses could work to provide affordability on the private side, but they didn't feel that they responded on the affordable side. They were concerned about the costs of expanding design review and of requiring things like outdoor spaces in the code. Their mission is to provide livable environments, and they felt that it wouldn't be beneficial to require those in the code, but those ought to be looked at flexibly. And then there was an issue that came up that we were unaware of that, they indicated that mixed-use developments with ground floor commercial or active uses can drive costs up for affordable housing projects because of the way construction is priced for those particular projects. So that's something we need to be mindful of. And then finally, for neighborhood businesses, we had about 25 folks that attended the meeting. It was sponsored by Venture Portland, so we involved the local association in that group. And their comments summarized here were largely, started with some concerns about parking in the development of mixed use. There was a recognition that mixed-use developments and the added housing that comes into these neighborhood corridors provide a great basis for more customers for them, but that many of their customers still do come by car, and that they were concerned about how we manage that parking supply. So they wanted us to look at shared or other opportunities for parking. They were concerned about design issues and were sensitive to the fact that neighborhood business districts have unique qualities, and were very supportive of the notion of potentially using design tools to evoke more local quality. They wanted us to ensure and recognize that not every place is going to be pedestrian or mixed-use district, that we still need to make provisions for auto-accommodating uses or more flexibility. They again reflected the community concern about loss of affordable commercial space, and they did also resonate on the notion of desiring commercial or active ground floor space in key places. So with that, I'm going to go on to our assessment report, which is, like I said, our first key milestone. We're getting ready to deliver that at the end of September. We had actually hoped to have that for you by this time, but our process got a little bit slowed down, so we just wanted to give you this briefing to kind of give you a heads up as to where we are, and then check in to hear any comments or concerns or directions you might have for us before we finalize this. So this is kind of the outline of it. We'll have a zoning history. We'll touch on the comp plan policies that are at play in zoning issues. We're going to summarize our base zones, overlay zones, and plan districts. We'll use those case studies to kind of characterize the performance of the zones in different areas. We'll touch on national best practices from our consultant team. We've talked about community input. That will be a big part of the assessment as well. And then we're going to conclude with some issues and recommendations. So for directions, we have, I'm going to summarize some of the comp plan policy directions that we're looking to evaluate the zones on. So again, we're trying to support vibrant business districts, accommodating housing and employment growth, enhance equitable access to housing and services, want to contribute to human and environmental health, provide pedestrian-oriented environments that are accessible. We want to use green design elements that enhance place and context, protect and enhance these defining places and historic characters where possible, provide opportunities for gathering spaces, art and culture, so the public plazas and spaces could contribute to that. Create quality environments for residents, workers, and visitors, so making sure we have good quality development, and provide those transitions between higher and lower density areas. So those are some of the key comp plan policy directions we'll be aiming at. The evaluation zones, I'm just giving you a sample of one of the ones we started on. It's going to really talk about what are the elements on our zone and how do they perform right now. We'll have some examples of development that kind of respond to those zones and what the character of them are. So they're going to range from the CS example, which is very typical of our inner neighborhoods here, to our general commercial zone, which is much more auto-oriented, but talking about what the floor area allowances are and how those respond to the zone. We're also collecting case study data on those 20 or so case study areas that I mentioned, looking at the demographics of each of those areas, what the market characteristics of those places are. We're looking at things like what are the average rents for commercial space, what are the average rents for residential space. That'll help us understand better what the dynamics are in those different areas so that we can evaluate the feasibility of different mixed-use developments as we get down to proposals. We're also looking at the development that's occurred in those areas, so we're mapping those target areas and kind of mapping where development has occurred and what type of development has occurred. We're still in the process of doing that, but we have pulled up a summary of some development that's happened citywide over the last 10 years in some of the mixed-use districts, and I think I'm just showing this for you to give you a sense of, you can see which of the zones are producing more or less in terms of the number of permits and units. What we're seeing here is that in terms of total permits, we're seeing quite a bit of development in the commercial storefront zone and the central employment zone. The CS and the EX zones are seeing quite a bit of development activity. In terms of projects, we're seeing more units actually being produced in the mixed-use type projects than in any of the other types of projects, although multifamily is a good close second. So we're seeing quite a bit of development activity in the CS and EX zones, and to some degree the CG zones, but quite a bit less in the CN zones, which are applied more in East Portland or in smaller scale locations, and noticeably not much development happening at all in the CO, which is our commercial office zone, which is one of the questions we're going to have in terms of what types of zones we ought to end up with at the end of the day. So we'll have more data on this in the report, just giving you a sense of that. A couple of other things we're doing as part of the project, we're working with Bill Tripp, as I said, looking at our different contexts, different right-of-way widths and different development contexts. So he's doing some evaluation of right-of-way width and building heights and how that relates to adjacent development. So this is an example off of the 122nd walk that we were on and one on the interdivision walk that we were on. So very different development that's happening there and right-of-way widths. So we're doing some analysis on how those relationships work. He's also looking at building models of building envelopes, maximum envelopes, which we can start to tailor to see how different zones, different ideas might respond and how that might affect with solar access and relationships to adjacent zones and nearby properties, and actually starting to model that to see how that might look, kind of from a ground level perspective. I mentioned the best practices. Dayat and Bhatia has just given us a report on their initial take on some of the best practices from these cities that they're looking at right now. And some of the key highlights from what they've sent to us are that they feel that simpler code structures could be possible. Several other cities are working with a fewer number of zones for different places. They're also seeing that many cities are requiring commercial in key places, so outside of downtown that required retail or ground floor active uses. One of the issues we've been looking at is residential FAR. They're finding that residential FAR is not often regulated. Other cities, lot coverage is not as often regulated. Step downs and transitions, which is an issue we're looking at, are sometimes required. Street level design standards are applied on pedestrian streets, maybe to a greater degree than we do universally. Some cities do have standards for outdoor areas in multi-dwelling zones, or I'm sorry, in commercial zones, and we don't have those currently right now. So that's something we might want to consider. And added height and FAR for community amenities is a tool that's being used in other places. And these are just some maps of the different patterns that they're looking at in these different cities. And I'm just flashing these up here to show you that, we're not alone in some of our challenges. Many of the cities have zoning that spans different lot sizes and different kind of typologies and often is applied to, very tight bands of Main Street areas. So they have the same kinds of transitional challenges between those commercial and mixed-use zones and the neighborhoods that we have here in Portland. So we're looking at similar types of situations. So just a few more assessment highlights from us, and then we'll get into what we're doing on the zones. We've heard some of our big takeaways in the assessment are that the community has raised concerns about the range of uses and scale of development, so we're going to be looking at that. Residential uses not being counted in the FAR, we want to look at that. It's inconsistently applied. We do apply it in the CX and EX zones, but not in our other commercial zones, so do we need to be consistent? Transitions, we've talked about, we're going to be looking at that. Context sensitivity, looking at inner pattern areas versus east side pattern areas versus west side pattern areas, are the difference in landscape requirements and things of that nature that we might want to be thinking about. One of the key concerns in the community is that the zones provide flexibility, but also a lack of certainty about what can happen. This is particularly present in zones like CG, which allow everything from residential development to gas stations and auto-oriented uses. So should we be looking at tightening that up or being more clear? Our zoning, as we've already mentioned, doesn't really currently provide effective incentives for many of our goals of affordable housing or public open areas or historic preservation, so we'll be looking at those. We'll be looking at things like building coverage and active use areas and the parking areas to see if we can make those work a little bit better if we're trying to achieve goals of walkable community serving mixed use areas. And then one of the key things we'll need to do is that our new comp plan may change the relationship of our comprehensive plan and zoning from a one-to-one relationship, which we kind of have now, to a one-to-multiple relationship. So we may have more than one zone that fits into a comp plan designation, and we'll need to look at what kind of criteria we might need to apply to determine how we appropriately apply zones, not only in the legislative process, but in a quasi-judicial setting as well. So I'm going to walk really quickly through these issues to consider. We've talked about many of them in terms of land uses, the use allowances in the zone, active ground floor uses. In the development of design standards, floor area ratios for residential uses, fine-tuning those standards for different pattern areas, parking issues. Also using massing in terms of step downs and setbacks to ease those transitions. We're going to look at the incentives I mentioned earlier for housing affordability and unit mix, commercial affordability, historic preservation and plazas, and then that quasi-judicial approach. If we looked at our current zones today, here are the kind of key takeaways of things that we were thinking about initially that we might want to change. So we expect to have a small scale zone like a neighborhood commercial zone initially. We expect to have a medium size zone, and we probably will have a large size zone. So for our CN zones, our small scale zones, we might want to consolidate those and readjust the height limits to allow more feasible development for mixed uses. The 30-foot height limit we have right now may not be a workable height limit. So that's one of the early takeaways. Our office zones, we've seen very little development in those zones over the last 10 years. We want to reconsider whether there's a need for an office-focused zone. Our commercial mixed-use zone, our CM zone, requires housing. Some folks have asserted that that's really more of a residential zone that allows commercial, so we might want to consider whether we need to have such a zone that requires housing or whether we would want to recast that zone as a residential zone. Our commercial storefront zone, that's kind of a workhorse zone. We've seen that it's done a good job of producing much mixed-use development and has been pretty successful. We think it's a pretty good model for maintaining a medium-sized mixed-use zone, but there probably will be some enhancements that need to be made to it, such as minimum lot coverage that might not be appropriate for all contexts. Our general commercial zone is probably the most flexible and largest, spans the largest array of uses. We probably still need to have a zone that allows for those auto-oriented uses for different key parts of the city, but we might want to be more strategic about where it's applied, and it might allow a broader range of uses or maybe limit housing in different ways. And then finally, our CX and EX zones are our large-scale zones outside of the central city. Should we be thinking about a new large-scale mixed-use zone that could span both of those? Whether it needs to have an employment focus or not is a key question. Our current EX zone is cast as an employment zone, but a lot of it is being developed as commercial and housing, so a traditional mixed-use zone. And then our plan districts and overlays, we're doing a review of those right now, and we're actually kind of calling those to look at the useful ideas that have been applied in those plan districts. Things like transitions and step downs are applied in many of our plan districts. We potentially could take those and integrate those in some of the base zones and then consolidate some of the provisions of our plan districts and reduce redundancies overall if we are successful in doing that and bringing those into the base zones. So a lot to cover in a short period of time. Happy to take your questions or comments and anything you'd like to touch on.
Questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you talked about active uses, and I wonder if that also encompasses community meeting spaces and sort of open community use areas?
Yeah, in some of our current plan districts, I think the Central City Plan District and some of our other neighborhood plan districts, we define active uses to include things like community spaces in buildings and things of that nature. It doesn't have to be retail space. It can be, even residential lobbies can be construed of as active space. The thing we're looking at trying to get at in the mixed-use zones projects is making sure that, or at least considering whether in key areas in those centers that we're defining, whether we want to make sure that buildings, when they're built, can accommodate those spaces in the future and flexibility for different spaces. And that might require a different ground floor type of building to make sure that we're providing for that flexibility. But I think what you're asking for is possible.
Other questions?
I'm glad you kept the scope limited.
Pardon me?
I'm glad you kept the scope limited.
Yeah, there's a lot on the table right now.
Well, I like the things you've excluded, like parking and some of those things. It was a good move.
It might be worth just mentioning where we are in the project. As Barry said, it's kind of in the scope, in the assessment phase, and so we're going to be starting to transition with the publication of the assessment report into the concept planning. And so we'll be back again probably once we get into that concept a little bit more, and then as we transition into code work probably again. So this isn't the last time you'll be looking at this project. And it was important to give you a briefing now because you're about to hear a lot of testimony about the mixed use map designations. And so we want just you to see the broader progression of where we're going with that, because it is a complicated sequence of several different projects lined up, all affecting the same territory. And that was one of the challenges of notifying the public about all this, is when we sent a lot of notices out to the tens of thousands of property owners, we got a lot of questions about, well, so how does this affect zoning, and when does that happen, and sort of the sequencing.
Okay. Catherine, and then Dawn.
I have a few questions, and a lot of kind of the slides were kind of getting at the edge of this, and you have a lot of mixed use or mixed zone blocks in Portland, and I have a feeling that's a part of a different process, part of the comp plan process, perhaps whether those get cleaned up or not. So I guess part of the question where you talk about step down and transition in corridors, especially as you're going from kind of a mixed use zone down into residential, is there discussion about re-looking at how those blocks are divided as far as zones are concerned, or is it purely just looking at step downs? And I realize it might be two different processes looking at the same time.
Yeah, that's a good question. So part of the mixed zone block question is really more of a comp plan mapping issue. So I think you'll probably be hearing discussion about that or testimony about that as you work through the comprehensive plan process. The mixed use zones project would be looking at, how we might transition between adjacent zones where we have those kind of abutting zones that might have pretty significant transitions. Ideally, or in many situations in Portland, we do have this transition between the higher intensity mixed use zones to more moderate intensity, for instance, multi-dwelling residential stepping down into single dwelling, but that's not the case everywhere. So where that is not the case, or it's not feasible to do that, we are looking at within this project, how we might transition on site on the zones. Yeah.
And even if we have a policy that says ideally we like full block zoning or not, there's still going to be a variety of situations. So this is kind of a toolbox approach, probably. You have places like Belmont or Division where it would be pretty hard to extend deeper commercial zoning with quite a bit without a lot of community concern. Different situation on places like MLK or 82nd. Vancouver Williams is a couplet, so that brings in a whole nother aspect of the middle blocks, and so we're just going to have to be responsive to different situations.
And so I guess back at you, and then on the comp plan. So is there a focus going on about trying to maybe alleviate some of the pressure that's happening on those mixed zone blocks throughout the neighborhoods?
Are you asking if we're...
Are you cleaning it up?
Elaborate on what you mean by cleaning it
Well,
up.
so, Design Commission constantly gets a battle between, at those mixed zone blocks between residential communities and what's happening in the corridor. And you've got, as an architect who works in those areas, you go and you build out to your zoning envelope and what's allowed by right, and then all of a sudden you're being told, nah, that doesn't feel right. And so, and it doesn't feel right because there's a zone line in the middle of a block that's very uncomfortable for the house that's behind the new building that's going up on a corridor. And granted, step backs and transitions are going to help clarify what maybe, if that's the route you're going to go, allowed by right by zone for a developer. But you can imagine a developer goes, I got this block, I can build this mass, and all of a sudden I got a neighbor going, I don't like that, I got this big building next to me. And I get that. So the half block thing's hard.
Yeah, and we have not, to date, remapped those half blocks to propose something different. But again, there are some situations where we have full blocks already, and in many cases we have. One of the problems is in many cases we have higher density multifamily zoning behind those corridors, but it hasn't developed that way.
So if I could just add, this half block mixed use, half block residential patterns, we have a lot of it. And in part what it's reflective of was the last generation's negotiation with neighborhoods about how we're going to grow. And that deal was cut that it only can go a half block in. What we're seeing with the comprehensive plan is these centers and corridors are really important for the growth and the reasonable sort of growth of the city. And we may want to go back in and talk about some of those particular centers where we have situations like that, and it's a case-by-case basis, and that's going to be refinement plans in the future. Because it's the only geography, it's the only way that you're going to successfully negotiate that. But part of what Barry's going to show through this project is if it's half-block of a certain scale, and we really need it to be, here's the best we can do with the tools we have at hand, step backs or otherwise, to make that transition, okay? That's the best we can do. And it's a little bit of truth in advertising. We're committed to having these centers. They're already on the books, and we can maybe make this tweak, but it's not, this is potentially what it's going to be like. That's a better situation to go back in on a focused refinement plan and have a negotiation with the neighborhood about, well, maybe it would be better if we took a look at a future that was a whole block deep, not just half.
And I guess I'd reemphasize that we're not alone in that. Many of those other example cities have the exact, or maybe not the exact same, but very similar conditions. So we're hoping to learn from them as well, see if we can come up with good tools.
I guess I just encourage you to take on the challenge because it is problematic. I see it constantly in what I do, and I hear it constantly from the community. So one way or the other needs to be addressed. And then another one, and this is, I think, an intersection between zoning code and guidelines, and you were kind of getting at it with some of the points that you were getting as clarity, yet flexibility, and what, obviously zoning gives us a lot more clarity, and then guidelines give us flexibility. And then another one of your points up there that you're hearing from architectural community and development community is quality and permanence of materials. It's such a subjective thing. And so, I think you either, what's a list, you hate to list the materials because materials change throughout time, but what's quality to you could be extremely different definition to me. So I don't know, and I realize you're probably not getting into that, but I guess where I'm going is it's that intersection between those two that makes things unclear and extremely frustrating for, I think, communities, for the community design standards, as well as design commission.
And that's an area that we heard about, and we kind of heard opposite, a little bit from community members and from the developer architect groups who in the community would like to have more ability to influence design and have more opportunity for review. The developer and architect and affordable housing groups certainly wanted to have a more clear path. So yeah, that's something we're going to have to straddle as we go through this process to see where that balance kind of falls. I do want to clarify though that we did hear concerns about quality of materials, but we did also hear from those roundtable groups that materials change all the time, and that we ought to be open to changes in materials, and maybe there is a threshold level that we ought to set that we could agree with all the communities, but we don't want to get too specific about those. So.
What do you mean by threshold?
Well, there may be some materials that are less appropriate than others but that we ought not go into too much detail about those in our standards.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And I'll give you a great example. It's vinyl windows. Vinyl windows, for the longest time, design commission said absolutely not. And now they're starting to allow it for very good reasons. I'd say that industry has come a long ways. And so I don't know how you take care of that in the code to allow that transition of material development. Good luck.
We'll get back to you in the fall.
This one's just quick, and I think you already are probably recognizing it. I'm guessing you just didn't say it specifically. But when you're looking at height limits, understanding that retail needs a greater height, and that is one thing that's been very kind of restrictive and a little bit difficult to deal with, is trying to fit all those floors on top of a taller retail base.
Yeah, we heard that both in the roundtables and some suggestions about how to deal with that with maybe some incentives or bonuses for a taller ground floor that would allow a little more flexibility. Yeah.
Great. Sounds good. Thanks. Good work.
Don?
Well, quick question. We're going to make decisions about this, about the code, the mixed-use code zone language, and we're going to make decisions about mapping where these zones are. Are those going to kind of run together, Joe? Maybe I'm kind of looking at you. You know what I mean? We're going to do comp plan mapping that designates mixed-use areas, and then we're going to do this code update or revision. Do those run on the same track, kind of parallel?
The sequence is you're first getting the comp plan map and urban design framework to kind of get the broad understanding of where the different types of places are. Then we're going to review the sort of palette of zones and the code that could be applied there. And then with that, on that roughly that same time frame, you'd also be getting zoning maps that correspond with that. So we haven't worked out the exact dates of those hearings, but that's a necessary, they have to go kind of in tandem.
Yeah, so one process can inform the other.
Right, so when we come, the comprehensive plan, the designations of the different types of centers and corridors of these mixed-use zones, that's first. But this development is taking place in parallel. What we follow up with then is within these kind of areas that broadly you're designating as either the different kinds of centers or corridors that I think Eric talked about when we talked about the map stuff before you got here, Don. There's going to be a set of different new zones with new standards and potentially other factors that will apply to those through a separate process later. But we know that for a certain type of center, the type of zones that we want to choose from are this and this, and what's the best way to apply it in that place.
To give you a specific example, just a hypothetical choice you'd have in reviewing the map is looking at a place like Division, your first question is this a town center or a neighborhood center or a civic corridor? What kind of a place is it in a broad sense, looking at the policy definitions and our overall growth strategy? Is it a big place, a medium place, or a smaller place? Then you look at recognizing we know we're going to need a big zone and a medium zone and a small zone for those different kinds of places. And within big places like Hollywood, you're going to probably apply more than one zone. There'll be bigger zones in the middle and smaller at the edges, or to reflect the character. So that sequence, of first determining what kind of a place is a place like Hollywood or Division in terms of the overall city, then looking at what zones are appropriate to implement that kind of place as that second step. And we will be proposing kind of as a bridge to that, a crosswalk table that says, if you've got this zone today and you're in a town center, this is the proposed zone. So we're not proposing sort of everyone come in and nominate what zone they should be process. It'll be a crosswalk that you'll have to review, and there may be some site-specific adjustments, but in general, a crosswalk approach.
That makes sense. That sequence makes sense to me, and it might be an opportunity to address some of the issues you brought up, Catherine, about mixed zoning blocks. Thanks.
I have a quick question, a couple of quick questions. Powell Division Transit Study. And so when I looked at what I thought was Powell, it seemed like there was not a lot of changes on Powell. And so and this gets to a broader question in terms of transit-oriented development and kind of the zoning connected to transit-oriented development. Is this looking at that transit-oriented development in terms of what the TSP is proposing and then saying we're looking at zoning that because of transit-oriented development, because of what that supposedly gives us, we're trying to enhance that some way?
I guess there's two parts to the answer to that, depending on whether we're talking about the code or the maps. But on the mapping side, Powell and Division already have pretty intensive mixed-use zoning, so there wasn't a whole lot of proposed change to those other than we didn't remove them. And it's a little bit too early to do the fine-grain adjustments to the zoning because we don't know which streets, which parts of the corridor will be on. So a little bit, we'll have to do some refinement once they solidify that. On the code side, definitely there will be a need to make sure that especially the more intensive zones in the palette work well with TriMet and with frequent transit and the TSP. So there's definitely a relationship there. And for example, with code elements around parking and transportation demand management are kind of the nexus of how that relationship is.
So Andre, think of it this way. With this project, you're kind of building the toolkit. And it's sort of more easy to understand how to apply it and which ones to apply to places that are already centers or center-like. PAL division, and another one is 82nd.
Yeah.
We don't know, and the perfect example too, because we've already been through this plan, is Barber, right? We've got a concept plan for Barber that's got notions for these places.
Yeah.
It depends on how the transit line finally turns out. As the plan progresses and we start talking about stations and which of these things are centers, one of the interesting things you'll see in the map in the comprehensive plan, I think, is we're proposing consideration of a center at 82nd PAL division, right? And so, today, our comprehensive plan looks at 82nd just as sort of an undifferentiated street.
Yeah.
And so we're starting to say, we already can see the potential at PAL division along 82nd. Montevilla, you'll see another one. And as our thinking progresses on this high-capacity transit line, PAL division, like where we actually know where the route's going to be, we sort of have a better sense of what a station might be and the spacing of them. You're going to have a toolkit that we'll come back with and say, okay, for instance, if it's a bus rapid transit station area, that's a new one for us, but this is the appropriate way to try to get more transit supportive or vice versa, development that benefits from transit around it and fits in with the context of the place. You guys will consider all of that. That will come into play after you're done with the comprehensive plan. But what you're building now is kind of the toolkit.
Okay.
And that diagram, the urban design framework, is something the PAL division project folks are looking at in terms of defining. We've already taken the first steps to defining what the key places are there just by the citywide look.
I'd add one more thing if I could on that, is that most of the places that we're designing for, and when we're talking about these centers and corridors, are pretty well served by transit right now. Some of them might not be high capacity transit. So I guess the question is, most of the zoning, I would assume, will be fairly transit supportive or transit friendly. The question is really intensity, and that's what you're getting at, Joe, that, after the plan is defined, you can kind of apply that more strategically.
And just the last question is, as I look at the cultural diversity of the businesses, especially in the east part of the city, and some of the areas where you've got designated for some of the centers and stuff in terms of the mapping, and you look at this, is the idea of how do you preserve those businesses, because many of the lots are very small, and when you talk about density or trying to get bigger buildings, someone's going to mass those smaller lots owned by a culturally diverse population into a larger parcel to maybe build. And so how do you, I know we're thinking about FAR and a trade-off, and we can't stop people from selling, but we need to think about how we have a mechanism to just prevent whether or not they're leasing or they own the property, that at some point it just builds out past them and they either can't lease that property anymore for a reasonable rate, or they're, and that changes the nature of a whole neighborhood. And we've identified that in some base maps, that potential, but how do we, FAR is to me a good start, but I think we need some other tools in that basket.
And I was going to say, I think that's going to be a tough one to kind of get at. We'll have to do some more research on it. The one good news, or the information that we've got from our consultant, is that they just completed a plan in Santa Monica that kind of delved into that issue to try to figure out how do you preserve any kind of affordable commercial space, and what kind of community benefits kind of arrangements can you get through zoning to make that work. We don't have the full details on it right now, but that's something we want to explore a little bit more. There are evidently some examples out there that we can learn from, so we'll be coming back to you with more info on that.
And we heard strongly about that issue, obviously, from on the Williams MLK walk that we did as well. And it was, in some ways, that walk was unique, and it wasn't so much about form as it was about business development and cultural identity, and how do we make that kind of shift. And not all of it is zoning. Some of it relates to economic development and the strategy there.
Well, I think that's the marriage between, as we look at the zoning and our intention of what we want there, and the economic development that we're really desiring out of there, how do we ensure that, that prosperity for all? At the end of the day, we achieve that. Catherine?
One final comment, and it's just more, I don't know how many people who don't work in this realm all the time realize that there are communities still today that don't have mixed-use zones, and I've worked in them, and it's mind-blowing when you kind of go to put a residential unit over a small shop in a neighborhood, and there's just no way to do that. So I guess it's just a reminder that Portland is, even though there are communities that done this, we are out on the leading edge, and I think it's great work, and love the fact that you guys are kind of studying it further and moving it forward, because it's just so disappointing when you hear from other communities who don't have this capability in their zoning code and what a fight it is to be able to try to bring them this type of enriched, active 20-minute living. So nice work.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I guess we'll hear back from you later on.
Yes.
We are adjourned.